to what if Deku became a ghost-like and check the author out. It was almost noon and a class of junior night students stood around a small boy, curled up in the corner of their classroom. The students laughed as the green-haired boy stuffed an apology to them. From the front of the classroom, the teacher sighed and let them continue. The quirkless boy didn't even look up at his teacher, didn't even try to ask for help. He has learned long ago that there was no point, that no one cared for the quirkless, not even his teachers. After a minute, the teacher had enough and stood up, telling all the students to sit back down and continued teaching, ignoring the smell of burnt fabric that wafted through the school as the boy brushed ash from his shoulder. After school was over, the class left, some paying to throw pieces of paper or rubbers at the green-haired boy as he cleared away his stuff, hiding it all deep in his bag, where no one could see the white notebook he has inside. Or so he thought. "Hey, Deku, what's this? Hero notes for the future?" Red Eye glared down at the boy, who stuttered uselessly. "How could someone quirkless like you become a hero?" There was an explosion and the burnt remains of the notebook were tossed out of the window. The boy's eyes followed the notebook as it fell out of sight, plummeting towards the floor. He turned to look at the boy who threw it and hung his head. "Why don't you just take a swan dive off the roof and hope for a quirk in your next life?" The green-haired boy was once again left alone, with no one there to help him. He was always alone, so it didn't make much of a difference to him. He finished packing up his stuff and made his way to the pond where his book had fallen. He took it out and quickly dried it off, shoving it back into his bag and making his way home by his normal route. Across the street, down the lane, under the bridge. His feet moved on their own, his mind running on autopilot, taking him back to the only place where he wasn't alone, to the only place where he was loved by somebody. Anybody. Laughing disrupted the boy's thoughts and he looked up, just in time to see a mass of green goo cover his eyes and fill his mouth. The creature said something but he couldn't hear it. Maybe this was how he'd die? Killed by a villain. Heroes were killed by villains all the time, maybe then he'd have something in common with them. But, of course, he couldn't have even that. There was a loud bang and a blue figure appeared just as everything went black. The boy's green eyes flicked open and he looked up at the hero who stood above him, looking down at him with a wide smile. The boy scuttled backwards and stared up at the man in admiration. "Thought we lost you there," All Might said, smiling down at the young boy, who was starting to fanboy. All Might just smiled down at him. He was used to fanboys by now. He just waved goodbye to the boy and jumped, leaving the boy on the ground, or so he thought. He felt a weight on his leg, and glanced down to see the green-haired boy gripping onto his leg. He landed on a nearby rooftop and the boy let go of his leg. He slowly stood up and looked up at the hero, who turned to leave the rooftop. "Wait, is it possible for me to become a hero, even if I don't have a quirk?" the boy asked. All Might turned around and looked at the boy. He sighed and looked down at the floor. "I'm sorry, kid, but you need to be more realistic. Maybe be a police officer? They aren't as flashy as heroes, but they still help save people." All Might smiled and left the rooftop, leaving the green-haired boy alone on the rooftop. The boy watched the door slam closed and then looked down at his feet. Even his hero had rejected him. No one wanted him. What was the point in trying anymore? He felt something run down his face and brushed the tears away from his face. He walked over to the edge of the rooftop and glanced down at the road below him. "Why don't you just take a swan dive off the roof and hope for a quirk in your next life?" That was what Bakugou had said. He sighed and closed his eyes, taking a step closer to the edge of the rooftop. It was worth a try. All he had to do was take another step forward. Maybe if he had his eyes open at that moment, he would have seen the green-haired woman walking below the building. Maybe he would have noticed the green eyes gazing up at him. Maybe he would have thought twice. Maybe he would have remembered the one person who loved him. Izuku Midoriya took that step, and plummeted to his death. Bakugou entered his classroom like normal. He took his seat, yelling something at one of his cronies who dropped his bag on the floor. He looked over at Izuku's desk. He felt like beating him up. He still hadn't forgiven the nerd for daring to want to go to even after yesterday. He clearly hadn't given up yet. The nerd had bothered to get his notebook back from the pond he had thrown it into. The desk was empty. Izuku was normally here by now. He must have been late, or maybe he didn't want to show his face after yesterday. Whatever, Bakugou would beat him up when he arrived. But he never did. The teacher entered the room, a solemn look on his face. He cleared his throat and looked down at his student. "I'm sorry, but I have to inform you that your classmate Izuku Midoriya died last night. The death is suspected to be suicide. If anyone has any information, either talk to me after class or go to the police." Bakugou felt his blood run cold as he remembered what he had said to Izuku the day before. "Why don't you just take a swan dive off the roof and hope for a quirk in your next life?" He stood up and ran out of the room. Rushing to the bathroom, he locked himself into the stall before vomiting. It was his fault. Izuku had died because of him. He had killed his childhood friend. He was responsible for the death of the only person who actually liked him. He was a murderer. But he couldn't go to the police. It would go on his record and he would never be able to become a hero. He wouldn't be able to go to "I'm sorry, Deku, but I will become a hero for both of us." Izuku's eyes slowly opened. He was still on the rooftop where he had met All Might. Had he imagined it? He remembered feeling the wind rushing past him as he fell. He remembered taking that last step over the edge. How could he still be standing there? Izuku, no. He looked down and saw his mother, covered in blood, hugging his dead body to her chest. It was then that he noticed that he wasn't standing on the rooftop, but rather floating above it, his red sneakers dangling above the building. He placed his hands over his chest, but he couldn't find a pulse. He wasn't breathing either. He reached out for the guardrail but felt his hand pass right through it. He looked down at his hand. He was dead. He took one last glance down at his mother. She would miss him so much. She should have thought about her. How could he forget her, the one person who really loved him? "I'm sorry," she said, knowing she couldn't hear him, and never would. It had been 24 hours since Izuku had died, a whole day since he had become a ghost. He had floated around the city aimlessly. He had checked up on Bakugou, who had gone home early from school, claiming he was ill. Maybe Bakugou wasn't as heartless as he had seemed. Now, he was floating above the high street, watching people pass below him. "Hey, kid, you're not allowed to use your quirk in public. Come down here," a police officer yelled. He ignored him and floated onwards. "You, green-haired kid, come down here, now." That caught his attention. He turned and the officer was looking right at him. His eyes opened wide and he flew over to the man. "You can see me?" He held his hands in front of him and turned them over a few times. "How? What's your quirk?" The officer backed up a few steps. "Of course I can see you, and I don't see what my quirk has to do with this." Izuku's eyes shot open. "Can everyone see me? Do I have a quirk after all?" He smiled widely and flew around the man. "I'm not quirkless. This is amazing. It must be some sort of ghost quirk which activated when I died." Izuku started muttering, trying to figure out more about his quirk. He flew over to a nearby building and reached out his hand, focusing as hard as he could. The tips of his fingers reached the wall, but instead of passing through, they touched the wall. They were solid. His smile grew and he flew back over to the officer. Thank you so much." He tried to hug the man, but passed right through him. "I guess I can't make my whole body solid," he muttered, floating away, making his way to a nearby beach. The beach itself was covered in litter, things that had either been dumped there or brought there by the currents. Izuku flew over to an old fridge and concentrated on solidifying his hands. He reached out and pushed on the fridge as hard as he could, managing to move it about a meter. He smiled and worked harder to push it as far as he could possibly push it. He spent the next few months working to clear the beach, but part of him felt that he shouldn't be. Part of him felt that maybe he shouldn't try to get into it. He was legally dead, and actually dead. He had killed himself. He sighed and stopped moving the chest of drawers he was pushing. I probably wouldn't let him in, a boy who was, legally speaking, dead and quirkless. And if he used his new quirk to get into it, wouldn't that be changing his suicide into a positive thing? He still wanted to become a hero, but he knew he couldn't quite bring himself to do it. He made his decision. He wouldn't become a hero, That would be his punishment for killing himself. He nodded to himself and carried on pushing the draws off of the beach. Still something was nagging at him. He still wanted to be a hero, but he wasn't going to be a hero, and couldn't become a police officer due to the whole being dead thing. He got the draw to where he wanted it to be, and flew off into town, heading to the library. He floated around the shelves about heroes, picking out random books. He found one at the edge of the shelf, hidden by a book on All Might. This book was different from the others. Rather than being about heroes, it was about something similar. Vigilantes. He picked the book out and scanned through it, adding it to his pile of books. He found a seat in the back of the library and sat down, or as close as he could. He was more floating just above it. He placed the vigilante book open on the table in front of him, so he didn't have to focus on keeping himself solid. He slowly read through the book, taken in by the pictures of different vigilantes and the descriptions of what they did. It would be similar to being a hero, only he wouldn't get paid and he wouldn't get the fame. He smiled to himself. That would work for him. "Damn Deku," a familiar voice muttered from behind him. Izuku glanced behind him to see a pair of angry red eyes and spiky blonde hair. Bakugou wasn't looking at Izuku, but rather at a book on All Might. Izuku recognized the book as one that he and Bakugou had read together when they were little. They borrowed it from the library whenever they could. It was the best book on All Might either of them had found. Bakugou wasn't reading the book though, but rather looking in the inside cover. He knew that's where the list of people who had borrowed the book would be. He also knew that it would consist mostly of their names, as they were basically the only people who ever borrowed it. Izuku watched as Bakugou started to look up, his eyes slowly moving in Izuku's direction. Izuku panicked and floated down through the floor, through the ground. He heard a confused Deku? But he stayed still, waiting until he heard footsteps moving away from him. He peered up through the floor and saw that Bakugou had left the library. With a sigh of relief, he reappeared and picked up the vigilante book, grabbing the rest of his books and putting them back on the shelf where he had found them. He peered out of the library, making sure Bakugou had left, before floating out again. If he was going to be a vigilante, he needed an outfit. Looked like it was time to get a job. Izuku floated over to his old house, finding the wall that led into his bedroom. He peered through the wall and entered the room. He floated over to the side where he knew he kept his money. Making sure to be as quiet as possible, he took the small amount of money he had. On his way out, he also grabbed a few pieces of All Might merch that he knew he could sell for a good amount of money. He floated through the door, into the hall and followed the walls to his mother's room. He pressed his ear up against the door and heard faint sniffling. He stuck his head through the door and saw his mother, lying facing away from the door. He crept over to her and placed his hand on her shoulder, focusing on making it solid. She started to turn when his hand touched her. "Don't turn around. I'm sorry that I woke you up." "Izuku?" She did as he asked and faced away. "Where have you been? What happened to you?" Izuku let out a shaky breath. "Yeah, it's me, Mom. Only, I'm dead now, but you know that. I watched when you and Kakin had to identify my body. I'm sorry you had to do that. I was too weak. I gave up too easily. I'm sorry. This is all my fault. But, I still love you, okay? I'll always love you, and I'll come home one day, when I'm worthy of being your son again." "Izuku, what do you mean?" "You're my son. You'll always be my son." "No, not now. What I did was wrong. I forgot about you, the person who loved me more than anyone else. I failed you. Once I've made up for my mistakes, then I'll be worthy of being your son. For now, I'm too ashed for you to even look at me." He leaned forward, gently kissing the back of her head. "I love you," he muttered for the last time, before passing back through the door and the wall beyond, to the outside of the house. He reached to touch his eyes, but there were no tears. He couldn't cry anymore, even though he wanted to. There was so much he couldn't do anymore. He floated over to the rooftop of an apartment building. There was no way to access the roof of the building without using a quirk, so he didn't have to worry about anyone finding him. The rooftop had become the closest thing he had to home. He would keep anything he got on the rooftop, not that he had much stuff. A few items of clothing he had taken from his house, a few sentimental things and copies of his hero notebooks. He couldn't get the originals, since his mother would notice them missing, so he copied them. He dug through his things, finding anything else he could sell, and things he didn't need. He picked them all up and put them in an old backpack he used. He flew around the city, looking for a shop that he could sell the things to. After a while, he found a shop that sold hero merch. He floated through the door and over to the counter. "Excuse me, I have some things I'd like to sell." The store clerk smiled down at him. "Hey, kid, what do you have?" Izuku took off his bag and started to take out the objects, watching as the clerk's mouth fell open. His eyes were sparkling and he looked about ready to start fanboying. "Where did you get this stuff?" "This is some of the rarest All Might merch around, and in mint condition." Izuku placed the last figurine on the counter and the clerk looked like he was going to faint. He grabbed the figure and turned it over in his hand. "The limited edition Silver Age official figure. I've never seen one of these before. This is amazing." Izuku smiled at the man. He had always been proud of his collection of All Might merch, but now it would actually be useful. He could probably get enough money to last him a few years, especially since he didn't need to eat or drink. The two of them started bargaining for the collection. Eventually Izuku came out on top, with enough money to buy his vigilante costume and replace it a few times if he needed to, though he doubted he would. He flew down the high street, buying all of the things he wanted. First, he got a wig. It was short and straight, and it was a strange pale blue-gray color, which he wanted his entire costume to be. Next, he got a t-shirt and a pair of jeans in the same color as the wig. Then a long cloak-like coat that went past his feet. It buttoned up down the front, but only to the bottom of his stomach, where there was a gap, making it so you could see his legs and feet. What couldn't be seen was the inside of the coat, which was lined with knives. He then got boots that went almost to his knees and, finally, a mask that covered the top half of his face and a pair of gloves. He put it all on and spun in front of a mirror a few times, admiring how the coat fanned out, showing the gleam of his knives inside. He smiled widely and flew outside again, ready for his first patrol of the city streets. It wasn't long before he heard a scream and flew over to help. A young man in an All Might hoodie had been backed into an alley by a group of thugs. One of them was slowly approaching them, with spikes that jutted out from his knuckles. Izuku flew in, solidifying his hand to punch the guy across the face. The thug tried to punch him, but his hand passed right through the vigilante, resulting in him hitting another thug, who was approaching Izuku from behind. The thug who was hit screamed out in pain, grabbing his stomach where he had been hit. Izuku flew through the first thug, confusing them, before kicking them hard in the temple. The man grabbed his head before collapsing to the floor. Then, the final thug approached. Izuku sunk through the ground as the thug tried to punch him, causing them to run into a wall. Izuku reappeared behind him and smashed their head into the wall repeatedly until he, also, fell to their knees. He looked up at the man he had saved. He tried to smile but he couldn't, so instead he just tried to keep a straight face. "Why, you should get out of here, in case they wake up." The man's face turned to shock. He had been saved by a kid. Izuku reminded himself to get some sort of voice changer before turning to leave the alley. "Hey," the man called. "What's your name?" Izuku flinched before turning to face him again. "My name is Fandom." It had been a whole month since Izuku had become a vigilante. Of course, as a vigilante, he wasn't exactly well known, but he would sometimes hear people talking about him as he walked past. "Isn't that the vigilante Hawks was chasing? Huh? Did Endeavor fail to catch him?" Anytime anyone saw him, they always just recognized him due to his encounters with heroes. He wasn't surprised though. He had become a vigilante, at least partially, because of the lack of fame. The idea of interviews and stuff frightened him more than villains did. But that was about to change. He was on his normal patrol, nothing out of the ordinary. At this time of the night, he didn't have to do much fighting. Mostly it was helping people out. Then, somewhere not too far away, he heard a scream. He excused himself, as he was helping some people who were lost, before flying over a building and over to an alley. In the alley was a girl, not too much older than him, being slowly backed into the wall. She had a bob of brown hair and brown eyes that scanned the people around her. I just need to go home. My parents will be worried about me." One of the thugs smiled at her. "Don't worry, beautiful. We won't take too long." Izuku gritted his teeth and leapt into the alley, landing on the thug, pushing him to the floor and slamming his head into the ground. "You okay?" he asked the girl. He had gotten better at changing his voice without needing a voice changer. Now, his voice was lower, making him sound a lot older than he was. She nodded sheepishly. He smiled at her and turned to fight the other thug but found that they had already been knocked out. A girl stood over them, her face also hidden by a mask, not too dissimilar from Izuku's. She had a skin-tight bodysuit on, with a utility belt lined with knives. She also had a cape with a hood that covered her hair, though wisps of pale blue could be seen. She looked up at Izuku with pale blue eyes. Her mouth slowly opened. The girl who the thugs had attacked had already run, leaving Izuku alone with the strange girl who walked up to him with an emotionless expression. Just as she reached him, her mouth broke out into a wide smile and her eyes started to glitter with excitement. "Oh my god. Are you fandom? I'm your biggest fan. I can't believe I'm actually meeting you. You're my hero. You inspired me to become a vigilante. Can I have your autograph?" The girl reached into her pocket and pulled out a notebook, handing it to Izuku. Izuku just stared at her, his brain trying to comprehend what she meant. Something clicked and he took the notebook from her hand, as well as a pen she handed him, writing his autograph on the page. She took back the notebook and stared down at the autograph, her eyes still shining with excitement. She looked back up at him, smiling even wider than before, with tears in her eyes. "Thank you. Oh my god. I still can't believe I'm meeting you. You're amazing." Izuku rubbed his neck awkwardly. Thank you?" It seemed more like a question than a statement. He hadn't quite managed to get his head around it yet. He had a fan? Someone who wanted to be like him? The girl's eyes opened wider than before. "Whoa, your voice is so much higher than I thought it would be. You must be around the same age as me." "Oh, I'm Spectre. By the way, I named myself after you. I thought the ghost thing was really cool." Izuku covered his mouth. In his confusion, he must have forgotten to change his voice like he normally would. Spectre didn't seem to bother changing her voice at all. Her voice was quite high-pitched, so he guessed they would be around the same age. "Oh, don't worry, I won't tell anyone. Like I said, you're my hero, so I wouldn't say anything that would get you in trouble." She seemed to think for a moment. "How about I tell you my name? That way, you can trust me, right?" Spectre smiled widely, watching for Izuku's response. In the end, he just slowly nodded and she smiled widely and held out her hand to him. "My name is Rei Hagakure. My parents are the pro heroes Zero and Marine." Izuku's eyes opened wide. "Wait. Zero and Marine, the invisibility hero and the squid hero? Maybe you have Zero's quirk, invisibility, since I didn't see you before, though I wasn't looking for anyone else, so maybe you have something more like Marine's, though the possibilities are endless." Izuku started to mutter and Rei laughed, nudging his shoulder. "Invisible tentacles. What? My mother Marine's quirk squid means that she had tentacles, like a squid's. I have tentacles as well, though they're invisible, since my father's quirk means that he can turn invisible." Izuku thought for a moment then smiled up at her. "Izuku Midoriya. That's my name. I'm not anyone special though." Izuku slowly took his mask off and pushed his hood off. He reached up and took his wig off, feeling his green hair spring free. Now it was Rei's turn to look confused. After a minute she broke out into a wide smile. "Izuku Midoriya. Nice name, though. You're special. Okay, like I said, you inspired me to become a vigilante. That make you pretty special, to me at least." She then took off her mask and wig. She had watery blue eyes and pale skin, and her hair was so pale that it almost appeared see-through. She also had a scar running across her cheek, just under her eye. The scar was an ugly red color, like a blade had been run across her clear skin. He held her hand out to her, with a small smile. "Allies?" he asked. She took off her glove, revealing pale fingers, dotted with small scars, and took his hand, smiling widely up at him. "Allies," she responded. "Now, come on. My parents have a safe house not far from here, but it's basically mine now. We can crash there for a while, figure some stuff out." Izuku nodded and she turned, being lifted into the air as if by an invisible force and carried over the buildings, Izuku floating by her side, smiling widely, his first proper smile since his death. Maybe things would be okay, just maybe. Bakugou took a deep breath before crossing through the gate into. Around him, others walked, each heading to the same place, each wanting the same thing: to be a hero. He wiped his sweaty palms against his trousers. It was just some stupid entrance exam, he assured himself. He would pass. But some part of him was worried. Worried that he wouldn't be able to achieve his dream, for himself and for Izuku. He entered the hall where the exam would be explained, unaware of the eyes that followed him. Despite himself, Izuku had followed Bakugou to. He floated through the floor, following his distinctive footsteps all the way to the hall. He couldn't help but want to see how Bakugou did. Even if he had managed to change the way he thought about him, he had realized that his admiration was stupid, and that it didn't make up for what he had done. Over the last 10 months, he had grown so much. He wasn't even sure if he wanted Bakugou to pass or not. Somehow, he felt that it would be nice to see him fail, to see him feel flat, even if it was just once. Ray had tried to talk him out of coming, but that hadn't worked. Izuku had expected her to apply herself, but she just shook her head, saying her parents had other plans for her. "They want to train me themselves, like homeschooling. Since they're both heroes, I'll be able to go to the provisional licensing exams and stuff. Only problem is my parents are never home to teach me, so I don't learn everything. That's also why I can be out being a vigilante all day and have no one notice." She did get him to wear an ear communicator, though, which was something, at least. Izuku found a corner of the hall where no one would spot him and floated out from the ground, listening to what President Mick said. He kept on turning to look at Bakugou, though. He was the reason he had come, after all. The boy was sat there, flipping a card over in his hands and staring at his feet. He looked a lot calmer than Izuku remembered, but he never knew what Bakugou was like when he wasn't around. The only side he had ever seen was the loud and angry bully. He had never known Bakugou when he was calmer. Maybe this was what he was always like when he wasn't around. Maybe Bakugou was only like that when he was around. Bakugou seemed to sense his staring as he quickly spun around, his eyes landing on the small boy, hidden in the corner. Izuku felt panic spread through his body, but quickly reassured himself that Bakugou wouldn't recognize him. Ray had spent almost an hour on makeup and he was wearing her pale blue wig, and even some brown contact lenses she had found somewhere. Ray had also decided that with all this, he looked more like a girl, so he had been forced into a skirt as well. Bakugou stuck his middle finger up at the girl who was staring at him, then turned back to President Mick. He heard slight giggling and looked back up at the girl, who quickly covered her mouth and stopped. The next time he looked up, the girl was gone. Not that he really minded. Somehow, the girl reminded him of Deku, and that just pissed him off. Still, some part of him wanted to see her again. He just stood up and walked out of the hall with the other examinees. He headed to where he was taking the exam, but he kept on feeling someone staring at his back. Whenever he turned around, there was no one there, but the feeling wouldn't go away. He reached the fake city where they were taking the exam and started to stretch. The feeling was still there. He turned around again and saw someone with long blue hair quickly look away from him. The girl. He pushed through the crowd, but she turned and walked off in the opposite direction. He kept his eyes fixed on her, watching her and trying to see where she was going. When he was close enough to her, he reached out to tap her shoulder. "Go," President Mick called. Bakugou looked up to see the gates were opened, then glanced back at where the girl was, to see she had disappeared again. He grunted and ran off into the city, exploding every robot in sight. Izuku hid inside of one of the fake buildings, watching Bakugou through the windows. The blonde destroyed another three-pointer, blowing it into smithereens, and he had to bite the inside of his cheek to stop himself from laughing. If Ray was here, she would be making sound effects as he went. Bakugou blew up another robot, and Izuku muttered boom under his breath. Though, if Rei were here, she would have at least tried to beat Bakugou up. Knowing her, she would have won as well and destroyed Bakugou's pride at the same time. The ground started to shake and Bakugou looked around him, spotting the massive zero-pointer. He smirked and started to run at it. He used 2 explosions to power himself upwards at the robot. He reached out, sending a large explosion at the robot, but it fell before he could. He slowed his fall and looked around, looking for the bastard who beat the robot before him. To his surprise, he heard a familiar giggle and saw the girl he had been trying to find stood on top of the robot, holding a cut wire in her hand. She dropped the wire and smiled over at Bakugou. Not quite fast enough, Kaken. Bakugou's eyes grew wide and he stared at the girl. Deku. He thought, staring up at the girl. Maybe she knew Deku? That had to be it, right? He knew it. He knew Deku wasn't dead. He ran over to the girl but she just ran away again. Wait, he yelled after her, too shocked and tired to run. You know Deku? Is he alive? Where is he? But the girl just ignored him and ran into an alleyway. Just as the exam ended, Izuku glanced back at where Bakugou was standing and cursed under his breath. Rei was going to kill him when she found out. Rei sighed and put her hand over her face. Izuku smiled nervously up at her. For such a smart guy, you really are an idiot, Izuku laughed nervously and nodded. Rei took her hand from her face and smiled down at him. For your punishment, you're doing all the cleaning. What? Izuku quickly glanced at the pile of washing up in the corner. But I'm a ghost. I don't make any of the mess. I don't even eat, so none of the washing up is mine. Rei stuck her tongue out. That's why it's a punishment. Oh, and it'll help you train at keeping your hands solid for a long time. Anyway, I'm going to go on patrol now. I'll call if I need you. Izuku pouted and floated over to the dishes, grabbing the nearest plate. About 3 plates later, he heard Rei yell that she was leaving. He took the last opportunity to complain and she laughed at him. Before leaving him alone, he carried on cleaning until he heard a beeping from his computer, sat on the kitchen table. He sighed in relief and walked to the computer, quickly checking the screen. A sound file came up and he clicked to start it. 0211, Rei's voice sounded through the speakers. 0211, the voice kept looping till Izuku shut it off and ran to get into his costume. 0211, a code. 2 heroes had found her. Help needed. Urgent. Izuku grabbed his communicator from the side and followed the directions to where Rei was. Not that she was too hard to find. Can you loosen the scarf please? Come on, please. Phantom's going to be here soon anyway. A tired voice replied to her. I'll loosen them once you're in custody. I recommend you cooperate. That would be the logical thing to do. Izuku heard the sound of Rei trying to fight back. Come on. Erase your head, please. My back's starting to hurt. Izuku understood. She had noticed him and was trying to give him the info he needed. He wasn't sure if Erase your head squirk would work on him, but he could at least surprise the hero for long enough to get Rei free. Where'd presentment go? He was here a minute ago, right? Or at least I presume that's why my ears are ringing. Hey, get off my arm. What's your quirk? Not saying. Even from the street, Izuku could hear her blow a raspberry at the hero and the hero sigh back at her, tightening the scarf. Judging by Rei's complaining, hey, Shota? Izuku heard a familiar voice behind him. There's a kid here. Izuku turned to see Present Mick and cursed under his breath, sinking into the floor and appearing behind Aizawa. He aimed a punch at the hero's head, causing him to loosen the scarf as he dodged and pulled his goggles over his eyes. Rei took the chance to burst free of the bindings and throw Aizawa into the far wall, before quickly covering her ears as Mick rounded the corner. Izuku flew into the sky, so high that Mick's scream was only an echo below him, before diving down again and distracting the hero, letting Rei escape over the buildings. Izuku waved to the heroes and followed her, flying through the sky and towards the inner city. Hey, Izuku. Rei stopped on the roof on one of the houses they were passing over. Izuku paused as well, turning to look at her. She just pointed. On the ground below them was a hero, dressed in blue. They had pale green hair and shining blue eyes. But the most noticeable thing was the tentacles sticking out of their back. "The pro-hero Marine, your mother," Izuku muttered. Rei smiled and watched the hero as they paused at the corner of the road and took a sip from their water bottle. "She hasn't even noticed I'm not home." "They never do, always too busy being heroes." "Taru never notices either." Izuku sat next to her. Marine moved on down the street, rounding the corner and disappearing. "Who's Taru?" Rei looked up at Izuku with surprise. "Did I not tell you? Taru's my twin sister. She's going to next year. We got the letter this morning." Rei's voice was cut off as there was a scream from the next street over. Rei's eyes grew wide and she looked in the direction of the scream. Mom?" She leapt over the rooftops and saw the hero lying on the floor, a man standing above her, his face covered by a hood. She was unconscious. Izuku was the first to attack, flying through the buildings and kicking the villain in the back of the head. The villain tried to grab Izuku's foot but their hand passed through him, hitting the wall of a nearby building, which started to disintegrate. "What do we have here?" the villain sneered. "A brat playing hero?" The villain's red eyes met Izuku's and their cracked mouth opened wide in a smile. "Why don't you fly away, Phantom? Go bother someone else." The man took a step towards Izuku, walking away from Marine. Rei took the chance and lifted up the hero, taking her away from the fight. She kept a straight face, though Izuku could see the tears building in her eyes. The man stepped closer still and Izuku aimed a punch at his head. The blue-haired man grabbed his hand and Izuku felt a pain shoot through his hand as it slowly turned to dust. He pulled his hand back and stared up at the man, fear clear in his face, and he backed away. "What's wrong, Phantom? You look like you've seen a ghost." Izuku sank into the floor and the man laughed, turning to the nearby alleyway. "Looks like we don't have to worry about that brat." "I don't see what Sensei was worried about." "Let's go, Kurogiri." Purple mist swirled, and the villain disappeared. Izuku reappeared from the ground, smiled over at Rei, and flew after them. Izuku quickly sunk into the floor and tried to find a place where he could see the villains. His hand still stung from where the villain had grabbed him. Maybe that hadn't been the best way to find out the villain's quirk, though it had meant that he could follow them without them knowing. Eventually, he found a spot near the bottles on the shelf where they wouldn't spot him if he stuck his head through. The blue-haired villain sat there, smiling slightly. "I don't see what you were worried about, Sensei. That little ghost isn't a problem." The purple mist guy, Kurogiri, handed the villain a drink. "Be careful, Tamura. Phantom is clever. Don't be so quick to dismiss him." Tamura took a sip of his drink and thought for a second. "He won't be able to stop us." Tamura grabbed some papers from the bar and flipped through them. "He won't get to the USJ in time to stop us from killing All Might." Izuku felt his blood run cold. "The USJ? Killing All Might? When? How?" Tamura looked up at Kurogiri and Izuku pushed these thoughts from his mind. "Has the brat responded yet?" Kurogiri stopped cleaning the glass and looked down at Tamura. "Last I heard, they said that they had made it in, though school won't start for weeks. They will report when they are able." Izuku waited for a while, though the two had clearly finished talking. He signed and floated through the ceiling. It seemed that he was in Kyoto. He sighed. He had a long trip ahead of him. He took his phone out of this pocket and called Rei. "I'll be late. I'll get home when I can. You need to stop running into danger. Your quirk might not protect you forever. Just keep safe." Rei sighed and placed her phone on the side, looking out the window to the street below. She was sat in a hospital room with her mother. She looked down at the hero and grimaced, looking away. Hatred towards the hero still booked inside her, but she was worried as well. Part of her hoping that nothing happened, the rest hoping she heard the long bang of the heart monitor. She rubbed her eyes and pushed the window open, using her quirk to lift herself into the roof where she had dumped her vigilante costume. She shoved it in her bag and powered herself to the street, making her way to an alley where she sat, hidden from the rest of the world, and let herself cry. Footsteps entered the valley and she stopped crying, quickly grabbing an old tarpaulin and pulling it over her head. The person seemed to be breathing heavily, as though crying not to cry. She heard the footsteps stop and the rubbish around her moved as the person sat down next to her, not quite noticing her. The person held something in their hand, a small metal disc. inscribed with the insignia. They turned it over a few times. Damn it, that bastard should have been here. He should have seen this. Damn it, damn Deku. Rei tried to keep silent, though the anger inside her grew as she recognized the blonde boy Izuku had described to her. Eventually, she swiftly kicked the boy in the head. He turned to glare at her, his tears drying up quickly, replaced with anger. You fucked up. You knew what you were doing. Don't cry about a choice you made. You told him to do it. It's not his fault he did it. It's yours. She stood up and looked down at the confused boy. And don't call him Deku. His name is Izuku. Fucking use it. Or better yet, stop pitying yourself and stop saying his name with the same mouth that killed him. Bakugou stared for a minute before grabbing Rei's hand. You know Deku? Izuku, and ripped her hand from his grasp. Yes, a hell of a lot better than you ever could. Enjoy your time at a murderer. Rei lifted off the floor, making her way back to her home over the buildings. She considered calling Izuku, but she remembered the washing up left in the sink and decided that she didn't want to be the one to do it. Maybe she should just head home, to her family. Rei. Two invisible arms wrapped around her shoulders and she smiled, burying her face in her sister's shoulder. You were the one that found Mom, right? Is she okay? What happened? Rei felt a pang of jealousy. Taru could care so easily. She's fine. I was on a walk and heard her scream. It was a villain. She pushed her sister off of her. I'm going to my room. Call me later. Rei resisted the urge to slam the door and eat on her bed, calling Izuku to say she'd be with her family. Not that she wanted to be. Trigger warning. Panic attacks. Do you think this is related? Rei slipped a newspaper to Izuku. He glanced down at it and shook his head. I don't think so. I think this is though. Rei glanced down at the paper. The two of them had been trying to find out more about the League of Villains since Izuku had first seen them. So far, Izuku had gone to their lair 8 times, been seen once. He did not scream like a girl, even if Rei claimed he did. Some reporters broke into how is this relevant? Wait. Krusty has a disintegration quirk, right? And if they have a spy then, Izuku nodded. Yep, they would have been after information. And one of the first-year classes have rescue training tomorrow. Rei furrowed her brows. Wait, how do you know that? Realization crossed her face and she sighed, putting her head on the table. Have you been stalking All Might again? Her voice was muffled but Izuku could still hear the exasperation dripping from it. Ha ha ha. He laughed awkwardly and Rei glared up at him. Izuku smiled at her and she sighed, sitting back in her chair. I'm going back to bed. Izuku grabbed her hand. But, we know that the League is likely to attack tomorrow. We need to be prepared. Rei stuck her tongue out at him. Fine. But I'm going straight back to bed afterwards. Izuku smiled at her, as kindly as her could. After what had happened to her mother, she had slept a lot more and sometimes he heard crying coming from her room. Sometimes, he heard her throwing things. Sometimes just deathly silence. Over those few weeks, he had learned 2 things: and don't talk about heroes, unless it's for vigilante work. And never, ever, mention her family. Bakugou took his seat and watched as Round Face and Four Eyes chatted at the front of the classroom. They would have liked Deku. Hey, Bakugou. Kirishima entered the classroom and ran up to him, grinning like an idiot. Me and Kaminari were going to the cinema after school. Wanna come? Bakugou looked up at the redhead and nodded. Sure. Sounds fun, he grumbled. Kirishima smiled widely and ran off to find Danki. He didn't question it. This was the way Bakugou had always been, as far as he was aware. Grumpy, but still kind and willing to do things for his friends. Yes, he had a bit of a temper, but he knew how to control it. Maybe he suspected there was more to it, that there was a reason behind it, but he didn't show it. He just smiled and enjoyed himself. Bakugou glanced to the empty desk and gritted his teeth. Maybe, if he hadn't said what he did, Deku would be there, laughing with Round Face and Four Eyes, like he should have been. Maybe, things could have been different. Finally, Aizawa entered the classroom and explained to the class that they would be doing rescue training. Deku would have been good at this. He always cared more about other people than himself. All those times that he would go rushing in to help someone, not thinking twice about himself. Maybe, he would have been a great hero. They each grabbed their hero costumes and got changed. Bakugou momentarily glanced down at the bright red trainers, identical to the ones Deku always wore, and closed his eyes for a second, thinking of every time he had seen them before. Maybe it should have been Deku wearing them. They climbed onto the bus and were driven all the way to the USJ, where they met the Hero 13, who started to explain it all to them. Deku would have been fanboying so much, like he always did. He should have been there. They looked around the building, staring with amazement at everything. All the different zones and areas, all the different simulations and situations. Deku would have loved it so much. He would know what to do for each one. He had watched heroes do it so much it would have been easy for him. He should have. His eyes met round faces and he felt tears start to gather in his eyes, pouring down his cheeks like rain. He covered his ears, trying to block out the voices around him, squeezing his eyes shut, trying to pretend there was no one else there. Why was Deku not there? He was supposed to be there. He should. Aizawa-sensei. Aizawa turned to see Bakugou curled up on the floor, covering his ears and eyes and muttering something between teeth. He fears that rolled down his face. He nodded and approached the boy, the other students stepping back and letting him through. He knelt down next to him and started to gently rub the boy's back, trying to get him to wake up from the panic trade he had fallen into. "I killed him," Bakugou muttered. "I killed him, I killed him, I killed him." He kept repeating the same phrase over and over again, his eyes now open but unseeing, blind to the world. Aizawa looked up to 13. "Call recovery girl. She knows what to do." 13 nodded and got out their phone. Aizawa looked over at Bakugou, sympathetically. He wished he could say this was the first time something like this had happened, but it really wasn't. This had become a far more regular occurrence than he was willing to admit. He just had to wait for recovery girl. "Erase your head." Aizawa looked up at 13's about and saw a swirl of purple just in the middle of the building. Through this, villains started to appear. The hero glanced back down at Bakugou and gritted his teeth, preparing to fight. Just before he jumped, he felt a hand on his shoulder. "Purple just is Kurogiri." Quirk. "Warp Gate." "Handyman is Tamura Shigaraki." Quirk. "Disintegration." "Don't let him touch you with all 5 fingers, trust me, it hurts." "Birdman, I presume, is Nomu." Quirk. "Unknown." "Avoid if possible." They believe him to be strong enough to take All Might. Aizawa turned to the side to see a familiar vigilante standing there. They nodded and looked down at the villains. "I'll take Shigaraki. You take Kurogiri. Just wanted to say thank you for reading this story. At the moment, it has 1.8k reads and I just can't believe that so many people actually read my story. It means so much to me, so thank you." Someone asked on one of the chapters about my update schedule. "I don't really have one. I'll write when I can and just post the chapters when I finish them. I'll try to post often, but I can't really guarantee anything." Izuku tried to slow his breathing as he looked down at the villains below. Aizawa still seemed to be glaring at him, but eventually the hero nodded. "Fine." Izuku nodded back and got ready to attack. "The others are just cannon fodder. Nothing to worry about." "Let's go," Izuku yelled and disappeared through the floor, appearing only a second later behind Shigaraki. He aimed for the villain's head but Shigaraki moved, dodging to the side and turning to look at Izuku. "Looks like the ghost brat came to play." "Not going to run away like last time?" Shigaraki tried to grab Izuku's head but his hand passed right through, giving Izuku the chance to rip the hand from the villain's face, throwing it across the building. Bakugou heard the sound of something flattering to the floor and saw it on the floor in front of him. He reached out to grab it, not processing the yelling from the rest of the building. He didn't notice when a purple warp gate opened behind him, or when his classmates made their run for the exit. He grabbed the hand and turned it over, looking around to see where it had done from. In the center of the building, villains swarmed, being fought back by 2 people, Aizawa and another he strangely recognized. They had white hair and a mask covering half their face. A pale blue cloak hid most of their body, but he could see the glimmer of knives flying from their hands every few seconds. They flew around the USJ, taking down villains and battling a blue-haired man, wearing hands the same as the one he now held. The hand must be the villain's. Bakugou! Someone screamed. Bakugou turned to see purple mist rushing towards him. He kept back, using his quirk to stabilize himself and flying up at the villain. He kicked the villain and tired explosions at it as fast as he could, forcing it back towards the doors. He attacked again and pinned Kurogiri down. He smirked at the pinned down villain, holding him down by the metal plating on his neck. Try anything and I'll blow your ass up so bad they'll be piecing you back together for weeks. That doesn't sound very her. Kirishima's voice cut off and Bakugou turned to look for him but instead saw an empty space. Suddenly, a villain landed there, an axe digging into the ground where Kirishima has been standing. Kirishima seemed to fall from the sky and landed on the villain, seeming just as surprised as Bakugou. Sorry, never actually picked someone up before. The person who was fighting before floated down, stomping on the villain's head as they talked. I'm Phantom, a vigilante. Now, the blue-haired boy made it out, right? Bakugou nodded nervously. The vigilante looked at him and seemed to smile, but he couldn't help but notice how their hands were shaking as they nodded at him and ran back to where Eraserhead was fighting. Izuku started to fight alongside Aizawa, trying to explain to him as they went. The students are still in the U.S. J. Kurogiri teleported them around. They should be able to take the villains. One made it out. He should be able to get more heroes. Shigaraki's hand passed through Izuku's head but he just smiled at Aizawa and kicked at the villain, pushing him backwards. Through the windows that made up the ceiling of the USJ, Rei watched the fight, nervously twirling a knife in her hand. Izuku was fine on his own, right? He wasn't struggling. He could fight the villains alone. And she shouldn't go anyway. Taru might recognize her. If she did, then her parents would find out and she didn't want to think about what would happen. She flew around the windows, looking to see if she could find Taru. Of course, trying to find someone who's invisible isn't that easy and Rei couldn't spot her. She just made her way back to where she could see Izuku and watched him fight. She turned and looked in the direction, hoping to see heroes approaching. Luckily, she saw the familiar form of All Might, rushing through the trees. Though he was still a few minutes away, at least he would be there soon. It would be okay. Izuku would be okay. Through the glass, she heard a strangled scream and turned to see Aizawa, pinned under the Nomu. Izuku ran to help him, punching at the villain, but it grabbed his hand while it was solidified and the him across the USJ. Izuku stopped by the doors and grabbed his head, fighting the dizziness and nausea as he flew at the Nomu again, reaching to save the hero trapped beneath the wall of muscle. Rei used her quirk to rip the window apart and rushed to Izuku's side, saving him from being thrown back again. It's okay, she whispered. All Might's coming. He'll be here soon. Izuku looked up at her. Our Spectre. What if she sees you? Rei winced then glanced around, not seeing any floating clothes that might indicate that her sister was there. It's fine. It's not like she'll recognize me. Besides, he could recognize you. She nodded her head towards the doors, where Bakugou stood with Kirishima, fighting off some villains. Izuku slowly nodded and turned to the Nomu. Rei turned as well and nodded to Aizawa. Can't die now, you still need to say sorry for catching me that one time. Also, Mick nearly deafened me, so he owes me too. Aizawa recognized the villain's voice and wanted to say something, but he couldn't move. He couldn't even look up at them. Instead, he just have an annoyed groan. Rei laughed. Okay, then. My favorite foods are pancakes and ice cream. Aizawa groaned again, and Rei laughed. Nomu! Shigaraki yelled from behind them. The Nomu seemed to react immediately and launch at Rei and Izuku, still pinning Aizawa down. Its fist left a crater in the floor where the two had been standing. Rei glanced over at it. I know I said I like pancakes, but I don't want to be one. Nomu got ready to punch again and the two vigilantes stepped back, more out of instinct than anything. The Nomu seemed to choose who to aim for and brought its fist down. The floor splattered with blood. One thing I would like to clarify with Izuku's quirk, he cannot choose what passes through him, and that what doesn't. He can make parts of his body solid for short lengths of time, and during this time, Nothing can pass through those parts of his body. This is why he can still get hurt if the solid areas are targeted. All Might crashed through the door into the USJ. He started to look around, hoping to see all of his students unharmed. Then he heard the sobbing. He didn't recognize the person who was crying. They sat on the floor in the center of the USJ, villains lying unconscious around them. They seemed to be holding something in their arms, but All Might couldn't see what it was. On the floor, in front of them, was a large thing, with its brain visible. It seemed to be unconscious, the same as the other villains. All Might slowly approached the person. Eventually, he stood over them. Despite standing over them, he still couldn't see what they were holding. The person looked up at him and he realized who they were. He had never met them himself, but he'd heard plenty of stories from other heroes. The vigilante, Spectre. Spectre surely realized he was there and her eyes shot up and looked at him with both fear and calm. Sadness and joy. Pride and shame. Her eyes opened wider then narrowed as something wrapped around his body, the end digging into his weak spot. He gritted his teeth to avoid telling in pain, then was suddenly thrown back, across the building. Ray stood up and surveyed the room, seeing two girls standing at the edge of a rocky area. She drew across them and half out her arms. Get her out as soon as you can. I'm not sure how badly she's injured, but she's breathing. The two girls have her a look of confusion before realization crossed their two faces. Taru, one, a girl with black hair, tied back in a ponytail, took the invisible girl from her arms, and, with help from the purple-haired girl, carried her through the rocky area, towards the exit. Ray watched them two with a grimace and ran back to where the Nomu was. It had a hole through its brain, as it had been skewered. Well, it sort of had. Despite the damage it had, it still seemed to be breathing. It was probably from that regeneration Shigaraki was so proud of. Even from practically dead, it could slowly come back to life as it was before. Shigaraki started to move again. He shakily pushed himself to his feet, retrieving a hand from the floor. Izuku floated up from the floor and took a fighting stance. Kurogiri also started to regain consciousness and the villains and vigilantes prepared to face off. I am here, came a yell from the crater in the wall where All Might had been thrown. Now, young Spectre, I do not appreciate being thrown. Izuku raised his eyebrows. I left to help a student for 1 minute. Seriously, Spectre? I took down the Nomu, so that's the most important thing, right? Shigaraki only then seemed to notice the unconscious Nomu lying on the floor. His face hanged from anger, to hatred, to disbelief. A measly vigilante had taken down his Nomu, his greatest weapon. How? Izuku chuckled and smiled over at Ray. Good job, Spectre. We should probably be going now, though. Now that their strongest weapon is down, the League has nothing left to write with. No way to achieve their goals. They'll probably just leave. He gave a pointed glare at Shigaraki who grimaced and turned to Kurogiri. Let's go, Kurogiri. But first, Shigaraki leapt at one of the students, stood in the shallow waters. His hand wrapped around the girl's face, but it didn't decay. Izuku ripped the villain off of her, and stood between them. Ray positioned herself behind Shigaraki, in fighting stance. I think it's time you left. Shigaraki seemed to start to have a temper tantrum. Kurogiri, seemingly used to this, just opened a portal, and the two left. Ray sighed until to her knees. I should have believed you when you said they were scary. Those weren't real hands, right? Izuku shrugged, running his fingers through his wig. He couldn't wait to get home and take this thing off. Maybe. I wouldn't be surprised. Kurogiri scarier though. Remember when I told you about the time he caught me? You mean when you came home screaming like a girl? I didn't. And even if I did, Kurogiri is terrifying. Also Izuku stopped talking and fell to his knees, gripping at his chest. He took a sharp breath and bent over. He tried breathing deeply, but that wasn't enough to stop himself from screaming. Ray looked down at him, panicked, then turned around and looked at Aizawa, whose eyes were glowing red as he stared at Izuku. She ran over to him and put her hands over his eyes. Don't use your quirk on him. He'll die. His quirk is the only thing keeping him alive. Unless you want an innocent boy's blood on your hands, Don't use your quirk. She removed her hands and Aizawa's hair dropped. She signed and ran back to Izuku, picking him up, only taking a minute to question how she could, and using her quirk to fly through the door and across the city. Back home, she placed Izuku down on the bed, tucking him in. Her phone binged and she was a message from her parents, telling her to go to the hospital. Her sister had been injured. She changed out of her costume and wrote a note for Izuku to read when he woke up. She glanced back at him and shut the door behind her, running across the street, making her way to the hospital, where her parents were waiting for her. They lead her up to Taru's room and Rei took her seat next to her sister. Taru shifted slightly in the bed, her eyes, presumably, opening. Rei liked to imagine that she's smiling, as her hand grabbed her sister's. Taru whispers to her sister, just quiet enough that their parents can't hear them. Thank you for saving me, Spectre. Welcome to our home. Rei pushed open the door and ushered Taru inside. The invisible girl seemed to glance around the room, taking in everything she could, before turning back to her sister. It's a mess. Rei shrugged. Yeah, but we're both used to it. She walked through to the kitchen and dug through the cupboard until she found the orange juice. Izuku had thought it was funny to move all the food around. He didn't need it, so it just annoyed Rei. Wait. Someone else is living here? Taru looked up from the papers she had probably been reading. It was just newspaper cuttings that Rei and Izuku thought might have been useful. Phantom lives here too. Oh, but I didn't tell him you were coming, so he'll be a bit surprised. Knowing him, he'll be upstairs, watching that video again. He's such a fanboy. Hey, Rei, have you heard about this villain, Stain? We should probably. Izuku turned the corner and floated into the kitchen. His eyes immediately focused on what looked like floating clothes. Is that your sister? Why is she here? He's stuttered. This is fandom. He's so much younger than I expected. And he's cute as well. Izuku floated backwards through the wall and Rei laughed. He's also socially awkward and a bit of an idiot sometimes. Don't worry, Izuku. She doesn't bite. Izuku's face reappeared through the wall and he slowly floated over to Taru and held out his hand. I'm Izuku Midoriya. Nice to meet you. Taru grabbed his hand and shook it politely, giggling the whole time. Rei, he's adorable. I always thought he would be someone and scary, but he's so cute. Rei laughed. Hey, come here. I have some photos of him from the entrance exams. Izuku stopped. He was still as a statue. The suddenly flew and Rei. Wait, you never told me you took photos of that. I may have taken one or two. Rei smiled innocently, but you looked great. Bakugou probably fell head over heels for you. If Izuku was still alive, his face would have been bright red. And no, wait. You know Bakugou? Taru looked at Izuku and he nodded awkwardly. He used to bully me. My quirk's called Ghost and it basically just makes me into a ghost. But it only activated when I died. So everyone though I was quirkless. In the end, I couldn't deal with it anymore. So I just did what it was he had always told me to do. I killed myself. Taru stayed silent. But Rei could almost hear the rage bubbling. One is her. Oh. Taru's voice was cold, but still filled with rage. After she seemed to calm down a little, the three of them started chatting, talking about life as vigilantes and a hero in training, talking about friends and what they like to do. Anything they could think of. When the sun started to go down, Taru left and went back home. Rei didn't go with her. The next morning, Taru left for earlier than normal. She took an earlier train and made it to the school before anyone else, even Ida. She paced around the classroom, going over it in her mind. The door opened and Ida walked in. Taru walked up to him. Hey, Ida? Ida seemed to jump back a bit, surprised that someone else was there that early. Yes. Hagakure? What time does Bakugou usually get here? I need to talk to him. She managed to not sound too angry, but Ida seemed to notice it. Why, has he done something wrong? Taru looked at the floor. Yes, something very wrong. The door opened again and Bakugou stormed in. Taru ran up to him and slapped him across the face. What the he is Izuku Midoriya? Taru said through gritted teeth. That name mean anything to you? How the fuck do you know about that? Bakugou said, but he sounded less angry than normal. and sadder. Does it fucking matter how I know? I know what you did. You fucking killed Bakugou. Out his hand over her mouth to stop her from talking. Let's go somewhere else. Taru agreed and the two left the classroom, leaving a confused Ida, still sat in his seat, considering whether to go after them. The rest of the class entered the classroom, one at a time, and, eventually, Aizawa entered as well. He looked over his class, quickly noticing the two absent students. Where are Bakugou and Hagakure? Ida looked up. They both arrived earlier but they left soon after. Hagakure seemed to be angry at Bakugou. I'm not sure where they went. Aizawa sighed. It was too early for this shit. Did you hear what they said? I believe I heard something. Hagakure mentioned the name Izuku Midoriya. From what I heard, Bakugou did something to Midoriya. Aizawa's eyes opened wide, well, wider. He recognized that name. He had heard Bakugou say it before. Izuku Midoriya, whoever that was, must have been the cause of Bakugou's panic attacks. I killed him. That's what Bakugou had said at the USJ. Whatever had caused Bakugou to be like this, Hagakure knew about it. He was going to find them. Though he couldn't see her, Bakugou could feel Taru's anger radiating off of her. What the fuck? Bakugou, you better start talking and give me a good reason why you said that. You were supposed to be his friend for this sake. Bakugou sat in the corner of the empty classroom, his head between his knees, hoping that Taru couldn't see him crying. I didn't think he would actually do it. Taru's glare seemed to burn into the back of his head. You told him to do it. You don't get to be surprised when he does. You were around each other all the time. You should have been able to see he was struggling. Because, believe it or not, people don't just randomly throw themselves off roofs. The door burst open and Taru looked up to see Aizawa standing there, glaring at her. Hagakure, what were you doing to Bakugou? She backed into the wall, wishing she could walk through it, just like Izuku. We were just talking. He is in a corner, and appears to be crying. Taru glanced down at Bakugou. Would you believe me if I said that had nothing to do with me? Aizawa narrowed his eyes at her and she smiled innocently. It's my fault, Bakugou said, not looking up. I deserve it. I did something bad. This is just a punishment. I deserve it. Every bit of it. Taru bit her cheek to stop herself from agreeing with him. Aizawa sighed. You too, come with me. We're getting to the bottom of this. Bakugou slowly stood up, wiping his eyes and staring at the floor. Taru followed, anger still radiating off of her. Aizawa lead them to Nezu's office and the two reluctantly walked in. Nezu looked up at the three and nodded to Aizawa. Taru and Bakugou seat down opposite the principal, Aizawa standing behind them with his arms crossed, glaring at the back of Taru's head. What's happened now? Nezu sighed. Perhaps Taru knows something about Bakugou's panic attacks? Aizawa nodded. I found her yelling at him in an empty classroom. He claims he deserved it. Bakugou still stared at his shoes. He could even bring himself to speak, yet alone yell. Taru had figured out what he did. He knew what a monster he was. She would tell everyone else and he sort of does. Taru sat back in the chair, crossing her arms over her stomach. Murderer. Bakugou sunk into his chair, still staring at his own feet. Okay, why don't you explain what you mean by that, Miss Hagakure? Taru seemed to sink into her chair as well. She didn't want to protect Bakugou, but this seemed like something personal to Izuku. It felt like his secret to tell. It wasn't her business. It's not my secret to tell, she said quietly, staring at her own feet. She wiped her eyes, feeling tears begin to roll down her face. She wished she could talk to Izuku, see what he thought. Nezu looked back at Bakugou but the boy didn't move. He just stared at the floor, thoughtful. The principal sighed again. Looks like he was going to have to investigate himself. The two students were herded back to class, but neither of them said a word all lesson. All they did was glance at each other, either with regret or anger. Even when Aizawa announced the fast-approaching sports festival, neither moved an inch. Izuku finished tying up the villain they had just found and Rei helped him to carry him to the police station, where they dumped him. They headed home and changed out of their costumes. Izuku floated by the kitchen table, cleaning the blood off one of his knives while Rei watched him carefully. Taru won't tell anyone. Izuku looked up at Rei. She always keeps secrets, I wouldn't have brought her here if I didn't think she would." Izuku shook his head, laying the knife on the table. "It's not that. I'm worried about what she'll do to Bakugou." Ray shrugged. "She'll probably talk to him, but she won't give anything away. She'll probably let him know that she knows, but nothing more. She won't tell him about you being alive." "Are you alive?" Izuku shrugged. "I don't know, but the sports festival is coming up, right? We should watch. I can wear a disguise. You won't have to." "Please." Ray smiled at him and nodded. "Yeah, I'm sure I can sort that out." Izuku smiled wider at her. "Thank you. You can wear the same disguise you used for the entrance exams." "No way." Eventually, Ray and Taru managed to force Izuku into the outfit he wore for the entrance exam. He complained continuously as the two worked on his makeup but had basically given up by the time they got to forcing the wig and dress on him. Though he did immediately float into a wall after they go is her and refused to come out, until they had to say goodbye to Taru. That is, Ray just wore a white dress, almost identical to the one Izuku wore. She painted a banner and folded it up and tucked it into the bag, grabbing Izuku and dragging him behind her. "If anyone asks, your name is Izumi Midori. We go to school together, okay?" Izuku nodded but stayed quiet until they reached the school, where he found it difficult to not start screaming like the fanboy he was, and would always be. Ray just laughed and dragged him to the stadium. They made their way in easily, buying some food on their way. Izuku nearly screamed when he was that they had front row seats, giving them a perfect view of the arena. "My parents though it would be good to watch it in person, to show me a variety of fighting styles. Plus, I want to watch Taru." Izuku nodded, worried that his voice was too low for the role he was playing. "Don't worry. Your voice is feminine enough." Izuku buried his face in his sleeves. If Bakugou somehow recognized him, he would rather actually be dead. "Gather round, mass media. It's time to watch the high schoolers you all know and love revel in their youth. It's a sports festival. Are you all ready?" President Mick yelled, the entire crowd screaming in excitement. Izuku and Ray just as loud as any of them. They both leaned over the railings, looking for the students to appear. "The students are coming out," Mick yelled. Class 1A were the first to appear. Izuku and Ray started cheering for Taru, who looked up at them and waved. A pink girl from her class asked her something and Taru pointed to them and the two waved eagerly. Izuku stopped waving as his eyes fixed on Bakugou. He sunk back into his seat, hoping the blonde-haired boy would look in his direction. Ray put her hand on his shoulder and smiled brightly. She didn't have to say anything, but it was enough for Izuku. All the classes emerged and gathered in the center. By this point, there was a group of about 5 people, all saving eagerly to Izuku and Ray. A red and white-haired boy looked at them and rolled his eyes, but Izuku's mouth fell open. "That's Endeavor's son. His quirk allows him to make and control both fire and ice." Ray glanced at him, still fanboying over the boy. "And how do you know that?" "Last time I checked, you didn't like Endeavor." Izuku laughed nervously and leaned closer to Ray so the people around them couldn't overhead him. "He tried to catch me once. Some thugs were after him so I went to help but they were down before I could do anything. He recognized me and I had to run." Ray laughed and eat back, watching the students as they shifted to let someone through. The student representative. Bakugou walked into the podium and Izuku choked on his drink. He closed his eyes, waiting for Bakugou's arrogant speech. Bakugou cleared his throat. "I will win this, not just for myself, but the person who looked up to me more than anyone else. To the person I let down. The person I didn't appreciate until it was too late. I will be a hero for them." Bakugou turned and left the podium. Izuku stared at him as he left. There was no way Bakugou was talking about him. That would be ridiculous, right? Taru was staring at him as well. He looked back at her and nodded. She smiled and placed her hand on his shoulder. "Don't think that makes it okay." Bakugou pushed her hand off. "Of course I fucking know that." Before Taru could respond, Midnight started talking again. Izuku watched the two eagerly. He wanted Taru to do well, and, well, he wasn't sure what he wanted from Bakugou. Just yesterday, he would have said he wanted to see him humiliated. He wanted someone to beat him so completely that he would be forced to admit that he wasn't the strongest, or the best. But somehow, He wasn't sure anymore. He felt guilty. He had never considered how his death had affected Bakugou. He had always presumed that he was glad that he was gone, that he no longer had to worry about the quirkless loser who always tagged along behind him. He looked down at his feet. Bakugou was that one who drove him to do this. If Bakugou wasn't there, he would still be alive. Maybe he would even be in a, but that's unlikely. He placed his head in his hands, everything that Bakugou had ever said to him, rushing through his head. The way he was treated, he shouldn't be the one feeling guilty for that. But, he had failed Bakugou, just as he had failed everyone else. Ray reached out towards his hand, Izuku solidifying it for her. She took his hand and held it in hers, whispering something to him. Don't feel guilty about what he did to you. It wasn't your fault. You didn't choose for it to happen. You didn't deserve it. He made a mistake, and if he regrets it, it's his problem, not yours. Izuku nodded and Ray gave him a sympathetic smile, though she really wished she was able to hug him. Izuku looked at Ray's hands and smiled slightly. It was okay. He hadn't failed everyone. He had inspired her. It was all going to be okay. Izuku and Ray cheered for Taru during the obstacle race, both screaming with joy when she made it through to the next round. The cavalry battle. Izuku watched as people got into teams. Taru's quirk wasn't very good for this, so she needed a strong team if she was going to make it through. He had watched everyone else during the obstacle race and figures the best team would be with the tape boy, Hantasaro, the gravity manipulator, Okako Uraraka, who looked strangely familiar, and the octopus boy, Mezzo Shoji. Taru, he yelled, go with Uraraka, Saro and Shoji. Get her to float you and have Shoji throw you at other teams. Saro can use his tape to pull you back. If she was surprised he remembered their names, she didn't say anything. She just walked over to the three and started talking to them. Luckily none of them had picked teams already and agreed to work with her after hearing the plan. Ray gave Izuku a big smile and turned back to watching the students as they rushed to get into their teams. Bakugou had teamed up with Ejiro Kirishima, Mina Ashido and Denki Kaminari. Endeavor's son had struggled to find a team, as he had come first in the obstacle race. But eventually, he teamed up with Tenya Ida, Momoyae Azu and a support course student called Mai Hatsum. After the time for finding teams was up, everyone moved to their starting places and Mick yelled for the battle to start. Bakugou's team ran straight at Totoraki's, Bakugou flying off in a desperate attempt to grab the half-and-half boy's headband. Totoraki threw him backwards with his ice and Bakugou had to grab out Kirishima to stop himself from hitting the floor. You half-and-half bastard, he yelled, aiming an explosion at Totoraki's head. Dude, that's not very heroic, Kirishima commented, grabbing Bakugou to stop him falling off. And you need to stay here. Saro joined another team so we can't use him to pull you back. Yeah, I know that shitty hair, he yelled, making another attempt at Totoraki's headband. Taru's team stayed near the corner, watching as each of the teams fought. They had managed to get quite a few headbands already, and most of the teams hadn't noticed. Taru's invisibility meant that no one saw her coming and Saro for easily pull her back before she got attacked. The only problem was that they could see the headbands around her neck, but no one really seemed to notice those either. In amongst the chaos, they went unnoticed for a while, at least. Whoa, what's this? It looks like most of the teams have lost their points, Mick yelled. All the teams seemed to glance at the leaderboard, seeing Team Hagakure in Wii1 place, with only Bakugou and Totoraki's teams with any other points. Every team seemed to simultaneously turn to Taru's team, wanting to take back their list points. Saro looked at all the people running at them. Hagakure, you're our strategist, what do we do? Taru sat in silence, and looked up at Izuku. Izuku thought for a minute and put his hands together, fingertips touching. Taru nodded and turned to Uraraka. Float us. Uraraka nodded and touched each of them, floating them into the sky where the other teams couldn't get them. Taru gripped onto Saro's shirt and turned back to Uraraka. How long can you keep us floating for? Uraraka shrugged. She was already turning green. I can't float myself for long before getting nauseous. Taru glanced at the timer. 3 minutes left. Can you manage that? I'll try. Izuku stared at the team in the sky, growing more nervous as Uraraka started turning various shares of green. His eyes were fixed on Taru, silently praying that she would make it through. He didn't notice the eyes fixed on him. Bakugou's team came to a halt as Bakugou started staring at someone on the stands. He ignored his team's attempts at getting his attention, just staring at her. It was the girl from the entrance exams. She was here. He had to speak to her. The rest of his team were screaming to him as they ran around, avoiding Todoroki's attacks. Eventually, Denki hit Bakugou to snap him out of his trance-like state. "The fuck was that for you, dance face motherfucker?" Denki nervously pointed at Todoroki and Bakugou looked over at them. But needing care, he just wanted this event to be over so he could find that girl. The one who reminded him of Deku. The one who looked at him with such fierce determination. The one who had called him Kaken. He half-heartedly fought Todoroki, his eyes still flicking between the girl and the timer. Her eyes were fixed on the team in the sky. Maybe she was the one who told Taru about Deku. That would make sense. The girl next to her said something to her and she pulled her eyes away from the sky, saying something back. She squinted up at the sky and mimed something, sticking her elbow out then pointing around the arena. Only a second later, tape shot from the center of the arena, wrapping around the metal bars holding up the partial roof that covered the stands. The tape made a small area in the center of the arena, high above the ground, where Taru's team sat, and Uraraka released her quirk, nodding her thanks to Taru. "I didn't know you were such a good strategist, Hagakure." Taru shrugged, looking over at Izuku with a smile. "I'm not, but I know someone who is." She looked to Uraraka with a wide smile that no one could see. "They're a great hero, the greatest hero I will ever meet." "Welcome to our home." Ray pushed open the door and ushered Taru inside. The invisible girl seemed to glance around the room, taking in everything she could, before turning back to her sister. "It's a mess." Ray shrugged. "Yeah, but we're both used to it." She walked through to the kitchen and dug through the cupboard until she found the orange juice. Izuku had thought it was funny to move all the food around. He didn't need it, so it just annoyed Ray. "Wait, someone else is living here?" Taru looked up from the papers she had probably been reading. It was just newspaper cuttings that Ray and Izuku thought might have been useful. "Phantom lives here too." "Oh, but I didn't tell him you were coming, so he'll be a bit surprised." Knowing him, he'll be upstairs, watching that video again. He's such a fanboy. "Hey, Ray, have you heard about this villain, Stain?" "We should probably." Izuku turned the corner and floated into the kitchen. His eyes immediately focused on what looked like floating clothes. Is that your sister? Why is she here?" He's stuttered. "This is Phantom. He's so much younger than I expected, and he's cute as well." Izuku floated backwards through the wall and Ray laughed. "He's also socially awkward and a bit of an idiot sometimes." "Don't worry, Izuku. She doesn't bite." Izuku's face reappeared through the wall and he slowly floated over to Taru and held out his hand. I'm Izuku Midoriya. Nice to meet you." Taru grabbed his hand and shook it politely, giggling the whole time. "Ray, he's adorable. I always thought he would be someone and scary, but he's so cute." Ray laughed. "Hey, come here. I have some photos of him from the entrance exams." Izuku stopped. He was still as a statue. The suddenly fluent Ray. "Wait, you never told me you took photos of that." "I may have taken one or two." Ray smiled innocently. "But you looked great. Bakugou probably fell head over heels for you." If Izuku was still alive, his face would have been bright red. "And no, wait. You know Bakugou?" Taru looked at Izuku and he nodded awkwardly. "He used to bully me. My quirk's called Ghost and it basically just makes me into a ghost. But it only activated when I died. So though I was quirkless. In the end, I couldn't deal with it anymore. So I just did what it was he had always told me to do. I killed myself." Taru stayed silent, but Ray could almost hear the rage bubbling. "One is her." "Oh." Taru's voice was cold, but still filled with rage. After she seemed to calm down a little, the three of them started chatting, talking about life as vigilantes and a hero in training, talking about friends and what they liked to do. Anything they could think of. When the sun started to go down, Taru left and went back home. Ray didn't go with her. The next morning, Taru left for earlier than normal. She took an earlier train and made it to the school before anyone else, even Ida. She placed around the classroom, going over it in her mind. The door opened and Ida walked in. Taru walked up to him. "Hey, Ida." Ida seemed to jump back a bit, surprised that someone else was there that early. "Yes, Hagakure? What time does Bakugou usually get here? I need to talk to him." She managed to not sound too angry, but Ida seemed to notice it. "Why, has he done something wrong?" Taru looked at the floor. "Yes, something very wrong." The door opened again and Bakugou stormed in. Taru ran up to him and slapped him across the face. "What the he is Yuku Midoriya?" Taru said through gritted teeth. "That name mean anything to you? How the fuck do you know about that?" Bakugou said, but he sounded less angry than normal, and sadder. "Does it fucking matter how I know? I know what you did. You fucking killed." Bakugou out his hand over her mouth to stop her from talking. "Let's go somewhere else." Taru agreed and the two left the classroom, leaving a confused Ida, still sat in his seat, considering whether to go after them. The rest of the class entered the classroom, one at a time, and, eventually, Aizawa entered as well. He looked over his class, quickly noticing the two absent students. "Where are Bakugou and Hagakure?" Ida looked up. They both arrived earlier but they left soon after. Hagakure seemed to be angry at Bakugou. "I'm not sure where they went." Aizawa sighed. "It was too early for this shit." "Did you hear what they said?" "I believe I heard something." Hagakure mentioned the name is Yuku Midoriya. "From what I heard, Bakugou did something to Midoriya." Aizawa's eyes opened wide, wider. He recognized that name. He had heard Bakugou say it before. Izuku Midoriya, whoever that was, must have been the cause of Bakugou's panic attacks. "I killed him." That's what Bakugou had said at the USJ. Whatever had caused Bakugou to be like this, Hagakure knew about it. He was going to find them. Though he couldn't see her, Bakugou could feel Taru's anger radiating off of her. "What the fuck? Bakugou, you better start talking and give me a good reason why you said that. You were supposed to be his friend for this sake." Bakugou sat in the corner of the empty classroom, his head between his knees, hoping that Taru couldn't see him crying. "I didn't think he would actually do it." Taru's glare seemed to burn into the back of his head. "You told him to do it. You don't get to be surprised when he does. You were around each other all the time. You should have been able to see he was struggling, because, believe it or not, people don't just randomly throw themselves off roofs." The door burst open and Taru looked up to see Aizawa standing there, glaring at her. "Hagakure, what were you doing to Bakugou?" She backed into the wall, wishing she could walk through it, just like Izuku. We were just talking." "He is in a corner, and appears to be crying." Taru glanced down at Bakugou. "Would you believe me if I said that had nothing to do with me?" Aizawa narrowed his eyes at her and she smiled innocently. "It's my fault," Bakugou said, not looking up. "I deserve it. I did something bad. This is just a punishment. I deserve it. Every bit of it." Taru bit her cheek to stop herself from agreeing with him. Aizawa sighed. "You too, come with me. We're getting to the bottom of this." Bakugou slowly stood up, wiping his eyes and staring at the floor. Taru followed, anger still radiating off of her. Aizawa will lead them to Nezu's office and the two reluctantly walked in. Nezu looked up at the three and nodded to Aizawa. Taru and Bakugou sat down opposite the principal, Aizawa standing behind them with his arms crossed, glaring at the back of Taru's head. "What's happened now?" Nezu sighed. "Perhaps Taru knows something about Bakugou's panic attacks?" Aizawa nodded. "I found her yelling at him in an empty classroom. He claims he deserved it." Bakugou still stared at his shoes. He could even bring himself to speak, yet alone yell. Taru had figured out what he did. He knew what a monster he was. She would tell everyone else and he sort of does. Taru sat back in the chair, crossing her arms over her stomach. "Murderer." Bakugou sunk into his chair, still staring at his own feet. "Okay, why don't you explain what you mean by that, Miss Hagakure?" Taru seemed to sink into her chair as well. She didn't want to protect Bakugou, but this seemed like something personal to Izuku. It felt like his secret to tell. It wasn't her business. "It's not my secret to tell," she said quietly, staring at her own feet. She wiped her eyes, feeling tears begin to roll down her face. She wished she could talk to Izuku, see what he thought. Nezu looked back at Bakugou, but the boy didn't move, he just stared at the floor, thoughtful. The principal sighed again. Looks like he was going to have to investigate himself. The two students were herded back to class, but neither of them said a word all lesson. All they did was glance at each other, either with regret or anger. Even when Aizawa announced the fast-approaching sports festival, neither moved an inch. Izuku finished tying up the villain they had just found and Rei helped him to carry him to the police station, where they dumped him. They headed home and changed out of their costumes. Izuku floated by the kitchen table, cleaning the blood off one of his knives while Rei watched him carefully. Taru won't tell anyone. Izuku looked up at Rei. She always keeps secrets. I wouldn't have brought her here if I didn't think she would. Izuku shook his head, laying the knife on the table. It's not that. I'm worried about what she'll do to Bakugou. Rei shrugged. She'll probably talk to him, but she won't give anything away. She'll probably let him know that she knows, but nothing more. She won't tell him about you being alive. Are you alive? Izuku shrugged. I don't know, but the sports festival is coming up, right? We should watch. I can wear a disguise. You won't have to. Please. Rei smiled at him and nodded. Yeah, I'm sure I can sort that out. Izuku smiled wider at her. Thank you. You can wear the same disguise you sighed for the entrance exams. No way. Eventually, Rei and Taru managed to force Izuku into the outfit he wore for the entrance exam. He complained continuously as the two worked on his makeup but had basically given up by the time they got to forcing the wig and dress on him. Though he did immediately float into a wall after they go is her and refused to come out, until they had to say goodbye to Taru. That is, Rei just wore a white dress, almost identical to the one Izuku wore. She painted a banner and folded it up and tucked it into the bag, grabbing Izuku and dragging him behind her. If anyone asks, your name is Izumi Midori. We go to school together, okay? Izuku nodded but stayed quiet until they reached the school, where he found it difficult to not start screaming like the fanboy he was, and would always be. Rei just laughed and dragged him to the stadium. They made their way in easily, buying some food on their way. Izuku nearly screamed when he was that they had front row seats, giving them a perfect view of the arena. My parents though it would be good to watch it in person, to show me a variety of fighting styles. Plus, I want to watch Taru. Izuku nodded, worried that his voice was too low for the role he was playing. Don't worry. Your voice is feminine enough. Izuku buried his face in his sleeves. If Bakugou somehow recognized him, he would rather actually be dead. Gather round, mass media. It's time to watch the high schoolers you all know and love revel in their youth. It's a sports festival. Are you all ready? President Mick yelled, the entire crowd screaming in excitement. Izuku and Rei just as loud as any of them. They both leaned over the railings, looking for the students to appear. The students are coming out, Mick yelled. Class 1A were the first to appear. Izuku and Rei started cheering for Taru, who looked up at them and waved. A pink girl from her class asked her something and Taru pointed to them and the two waved eagerly. Izuku stopped waving as his eyes fixed on Bakugou. He sunk back into his seat, hoping the blonde-haired boy would look in his direction. Rei put her hand on his shoulder and smiled brightly. She didn't have to say anything, but it was enough for Izuku. All the classes emerged and gathered in the center. By this point, there was a group of about 5 people, all saving eagerly to Izuku and Rei. A red and white-haired boy looked at them and rolled his eyes, but Izuku's mouth fell open. That's Endeavor's son. His quirk allows him to make and control both fire and ice. Rei glanced at him, still fanboying over the boy. And how do you know that? Last time I checked, you didn't like Endeavor. Izuku laughed nervously and leaned closer to Rei so the people around them couldn't overhead him. He tried to catch me once. Some thugs were after him, so I went to help, but they were down before I could do anything. He recognized me and I had to run. Rei laughed and eat back, watching the students as they shifted to let someone through. The student representative. Bakugou walked into the podium and Izuku choked on his drink. He closed his eyes, waiting for Bakugou's arrogant speech. Bakugou cleared his throat. I will win this, not just for myself, but the person who looked up to me more than anyone else. To the person I let down. The person I didn't appreciate until it was too late. I will be a hero for them." Bakugou turned and left the podium. Izuku stared at him as he left. There was no way Bakugou was talking about him. That would be ridiculous, right? Taru was staring at him as well. He looked back at her and nodded. She smiled and placed her hand on his shoulder. "Don't think that makes it okay." Bakugou pushed her hand off. "Of course I fucking know that." Before Taru could respond, Midnight started talking again. Izuku watched the two eagerly. He wanted Taru to do well, and, well, he wasn't sure what he wanted from Bakugou. Just yesterday, he would have said he wanted to see him humiliated. He wanted someone to beat him so completely that he would be forced to admit that he wasn't the strongest, or the best. But somehow, he wasn't sure anymore. He felt guilty. He had never considered how his death had affected Bakugou. He had always presumed that he was glad that he was gone, that he no longer had to worry about the quirkless loser who always tagged along behind him. He looked down at his feet. Bakugou was that one who drove him to do this. If Bakugou wasn't there, he would still be alive, maybe he would even be in a, but that's unlikely. He placed his head in his hands, everything that Bakugou had ever said to him, rushing through his head. The way he was treated, he shouldn't be the one feeling guilty for that. But, he had failed Bakugou, just as he had failed everyone else. Rei reached out towards his hand, Izuku solidifying it for her. She took his hand and held it in hers, whispering something to him. "Don't feel guilty about what he did to you. It wasn't your fault. You didn't choose for it to happen, you didn't deserve it. He made a mistake, and if he regrets it, it's his problem, not yours." Izuku nodded and Rei gave him a sympathetic smile, though she really wished she was able to hug him. Izuku looked at Rei's hands and smiled slightly. It was okay. He hadn't failed everyone. He had inspired her. It was all going to be okay. Izuku and Rei cheered for Taru during the obstacle race, both screaming with joy when she made it through to the next round. The cavalry battle. Izuku watched as people got into teams. Taru's quirk wasn't very good for this, so she needed a strong team if she was going to make it through. He had watched everyone else during the obstacle race and figures the best team would be with the tape boy, Hantasaro, the gravity manipulator, Okako Uraraka, who looked strangely familiar, and the octopus boy, Mezzo Shoji. "Taru," he yelled, "go with Uraraka, Saro and Shoji. Get her to float you and have Shoji throw you at other teams. Saro can use his tape to pull you back." If she was surprised he remembered their names, she didn't say anything. She just walked over to the three and started talking to them. Luckily none of them had picked teams already and agreed to work with her after hearing the plan. Rei gave Izuku a big smile and turned back to watching the students as they rushed to get into their teams. Bakugou had teamed up with Ejiro Kirishima, Mina Ashido and Denki Kaminari. Endeavor's son had struggled to find a team, as he had come first in the obstacle race, but eventually, he teamed up with Tenya Ida, Momoyae Azu and a support course student called Mai Hatsum. After the time for finding teams was up, everyone moved to their starting places and Mick yelled for the battle to start. Bakugou's team ran straight at Totoraki's, Bakugou flying off in a desperate attempt to grab the half-and-half boy's headband. Totoraki threw him backwards with his ice and Bakugou had to grab at Kirishima to stop himself from hitting the floor. "You half-and-half bastard," he yelled, aiming an explosion at Totoraki's head. "Dude, that's not very heroic," Kirishima commented, grabbing Bakugou to stop him falling off. "And you need to stay here. Saro joined another team so we can't use him to pull you back." "Yeah, I know that shitty hair," he yelled, making another attempt at Totoraki's headband. Taru's team stayed near the corner, watching as each of the teams fought. They had managed to get quite a few headbands already, and most of the teams hadn't noticed. Taru's invisibility meant that no one saw her coming and Saro for easily pull her back before she got attacked. The only problem was that they could see the headbands around her neck, but no one really seemed to notice those either. In amongst the chaos, they went unnoticed for a while, at least. "Whoa, what's this? It looks like most of the teams have lost their points," Mick yelled. All the teams seemed to glance at the leaderboard, seeing Team Hagakure in Wii1 place, with only Bakugou and Todoroki's teams with any other points. Every team seemed to simultaneously turn to Taru's team, wanting to take back their list points. Sero looked at all the people running at them. Hagakure, you're our strategist, what do we do? Taru sat in silence, and looked up at Izuku. Izuku thought for a minute and put his hands together, fingertips touching. Taru nodded and turned to Uraraka. Float us. Uraraka nodded and touched each of them, floating them into the sky where the other teams couldn't get them. Taru gripped onto Sero's shirt and turned back to Uraraka. How long can you keep us floating for? Uraraka shrugged. She was already turning green. I can't float myself for long before getting nauseous. Taru glanced at the timer. 3 minutes left. Can you manage that? I'll try. Izuku stared at the team in the sky, growing more nervous as Uraraka started turning various shares of green. His eyes were fixed on Taru, silently praying that she would make it through. He didn't notice the eyes fixed on him. Bakugou's team came to a halt as Bakugou started staring at someone on the stands. He ignored his team's attempts at getting his attention, just staring at her. It was the girl from the entrance exams. She was here. He had to speak to her. The rest of his team were screaming to him as they ran around, avoiding Todoroki's attacks. Eventually, Denki hit Bakugou to snap him out of his trance-like state. The fuck was that for you, dance-face motherfucker? Denki nervously pointed at Todoroki and Bakugou looked over at them. But needing care, he just wanted this event to be over so he could find that girl. The one who reminded him of Deku. The one who looked at him with such fierce determination. The one who had called him Kaken. He half-heartedly fought Todoroki, his eyes still flicking between the girl and the timer. Her eyes were fixed on the team in the sky. Maybe she was the one who told Taru about Deku. That would make sense. The girl next to her said something to her and she pulled her eyes away from the sky, saying something back. She squinted up at the sky and mimed something, sticking her elbow out then pointing around the arena. Only a second later, tape shot from the center of the arena, wrapping around the metal bars holding up the partial roof that covered the stands. The tape made a small area in the center of the arena, high above the ground, where Taru's team sat, and Uraraka released her quirk, nodding her thanks to Taru. I didn't know you were such a good strategist, Hagakure. Taru shrugged, looking over at Izuku with a smile. I'm not, but I know someone who is. She looked to Uraraka with a wide smile that no one could see. They're a great hero, the greatest hero I will ever meet. Taru walked out into the cafeteria where competitors and friends were eating. She looked around, hoping to see Izuku and Rei. Eventually, she saw them, sat in the corner of the room, trying to avoid Mineta. Suck a dick you great p-fuck, Rei yelled at him, kicking him in the face as he tried to look up the skirt. Taru laughed and Izuku looked up at her, looking more afraid than she had ever seen him, stood halfway into the wall. Rei kicked Mineta again and smiled up at her sister. Taru, you were great. Who is this fucker? He says he's in your class. Taru walked over to them, flipping Mineta off. He is, unfortunately. You okay there, Izumi? Izuku nodded slowly, not taking his eyes off Mineta. His eyes then suddenly shot up and he sunk into the floor. Hey, Invisibitch. Bakugou stomped over to them. Taru narrowed her eyes and Rei resisted the urge to punch him. He looked over at Rei. You're the alleyway girl. Yeah. Fuck do you want? Where's the girl you were sat with? Rei felt a shiver run down her spine. Why was he interested in where Izuku was? Had he seen through his disguise? I don't see why it's any of your business. You want to torment her as well? Do you not remember what happened last time? Bakugou stopped moving and started at her, before looking at the floor, his arms dropping to his sides. I just wanna. Whatever. I deserve it. Mineta watched in confusion as Bakugou turned and left, staring at the ground. Taru crossed her arms and glared at him. You can come out now, Izumi. He's gone. Izuku's head peeped through the floor and he reappeared, standing behind Rei. Thanks. He's scarier than Shigaraki and that purple scar guy we saw sneaking around Endeavor's house combined. Rei laughed. Oh yeah, I forgot about that guy. You remember the way he looked at the half and half boy? Wait, you mean Todoroki? Taru asked, pointing her elbow towards the red and white-haired boy. Yeah, he either knew him and missed him a lot or was going to do something to him. Yo. Taru winced. I wanna ask Todoroki about him, but I'm not sure how to start that conversation. Hey, Todoroki, I was once sneaking around your house, don't ask why, and saw this creepy-looking guy. Any idea who he was? Taru snorted. Yeah. Maybe not. Maybe offer to kill his dad first. He thinks no one can tell, but he has serious daddy issues. What? Mineta stares up at them, his mouth wide. Oh, I forgot he was here. Do you think he'll tell anyone about this? I mean, sneaking around the number 2 hero's house is usually seen as suspicious. Nah, he's a coward. He won't tell anyone. Rigged. Taru leant down and glared at Mineta. Right? Mineta paled and nodded slowly. Good. Now, go away. I'll pretend I didn't see you looking up Izumi's skirt. Izuku squealed and grabbed the skirt of his dress, stepping into the wall. Ray snorted. At least Bakugou left. Yeah, he's probably off crying somewhere, feeling sorry for himself. Bastard. Izuku smiled up at Ray, who grinned back at him and grabbed Taru by the arm. Come on, you need to get some food. You have some fights to win. Taru and Ray are quickly, all too aware of the green eyes that watched them. Izuku hadn't thought of himself as a food lover, but he missed food. He hadn't been able to eat since he died, and he had tried to. Lots of times. It never worked out. What does it taste like? I always wanted to try Lunch Rush's food. It's said to be the best. Ray looked up at him, forcing a smile. She hated that she had only met Izuku after his death, even though that didn't seem real to her. He was just there, so alive. That's how he always seemed, even if he was anything but. It's good. It's not too hot but not too cold either. Slightly spicy but not enough that you have to have a drink with it. Izuku sat back in his seat and nodded. Ray's description wasn't the best, but he was fine with that. Taru was the first to stand up when they were finished, and the three made their way to put their rays away, just as the third years entered. Izuku walked next to Taru, listening eagerly to the two sisters as they discussed strategy, joining in with his own ideas every few seconds. He was so focused on their conversation that he didn't notice the boy until he floated right into him. I'm so sorry, I didn't see you. Wait. Izuku looked up at the boy in confusion, and the boy looked back at him with the same stunned look. How did you crash into me? I had my quirk activated. It makes things pass right through me. Izuku and the boy looked at each other, Ray and Taru looking in confusion. Izuku had floated into someone, but he couldn't solidify his whole body, and he'd floated through people before as well. But this time, he had walked into the person. What's your quirk? Izuku asked the blonde boy, towering over him. He was probably a third year, judging by his height. The two students stood behind him were probably his classmates. Permeation, the boy replied. I'm Mirio Tagata. By the way, Ray tried not to respond to the name. He was working with the pro hero Sir Night Eye. He could be a problem if he were to recognize Izuku. Izuku nodded, probably recognizing the boy's name as well. Izumi Midori. My quirk's called Spirit. I usually pass through things, unless I want to touch them. Mirio smiled widely. Taru smiled. He seemed like the Kirishima of his class. So your quirk is basically the opposite of mine. I can pass through things if I want, but I usually don't. Izuku thought for a minute, then looked up at Mirio nervously. Could you activate your quirk on your whole body, except for your feet? Mirio looked confused but nodded, activating his quirk as Izuku had asked. Izuku's smile grew wide, till it was almost bursting out of his chest, and he wrapped his arms around the boy, burying his face in his shoulder. If he could cry, he could guarantee he would be crying now. It's been so long. Mirio slowly wrapped his arms around Izuku. It's okay, I got you. After the break, which Izuku managed to get through without encountering Bakugou, Izuku and Ray found their seats in the stands. Ray had grabbed some more snacks that she started to eat before Mick had even said anything. Taru had made her way to her class's spot in the stands and was stood, looking down at the crowds, scanning for her two vigilante friends. Bakugou stormed into the stands and collapsed into the seat next to her. He started scanning the crowd as well, hoping to see the girl. He hadn't seen her during the break and it was unlikely he would ever see her again if he didn't find her before the end of the sports festival. After a few minutes of waiting, Mick took the stand and announced the first fight. It was some Class B kid against Kamino. It was obvious how that one would end. Taru watched the big screen, showing the fights and the orders. After Ida and the support course girls fight, she was up against Bakugou. She wasn't looking forward to it. Over in the stands, Izuku and Rei were having the same worries. Luckily, they were in the first row. Deku could hear some of what was being said and could yell advice. But there wasn't much Taru could do against Bakugou. Luckily for her, the support girl kept the fight going for a long time, using it as more of an advert of her own inventions than anything. The fight went on for 10 minutes before she walked out of bounds. Taru sat in her preparation room, watching the fight on the screen. She sighed as the fight finished and stood up, ready to head out into the arena. On the other side, Bakugou was, reluctantly, doing the same. He needed to befriend Taru if he wanted to find out about the girl, though he wasn't sure if that was even possible. Taru was the first to appear, followed closely by Bakugou stomping out from his side of the arena. The two faced each other, Bakugou trying not to glare at her, and only half succeeding. Present Mick yelled for the match to begin and Bakugou aimed an explosion at Taru, hoping to finish it quickly. Taru's shirt was blown out of bonds, though Taru had dodged the attack, using the smoke cover to take off her shoes and the rest of her clothes. She quietly snuck up on Bakugou, as he looked around, trying to see anything that might show him where the invisible girl was. She leapt at him, grabbing him by the arm and throwing him towards the edge of the arena. He stopped himself and held up a hand, firing an explosion at his attacker. Taru cursed as the attack grazed her, brushing Sora off of her back as quickly as she could. Bakugou ran at where the sound had come from, missing by less than an inch, and he spun around, aiming an explosion near Taru. Taru nearly screamed as she jumped out of the way, just in time to avoid being barbecued. "Are you trying to kill me? Surely one victim is enough for you," she yelled, hoping it was enough to distract him. It was. He stopped moving, his face fixed in a look of dismay and regret. Taru ran at him again, pushing him with all her might towards the edge. He snapped out of his trance, grabbing her wrist and throwing her over the edge. She landed on the grass, rubbing her aching wrist as she glared up at Bakugou, still stood there, unmoving. "Shit, I broke him," Taru thought as she stood up. Mick still hadn't announced Bakugou's win, probably because they couldn't tell she was out of bounds. You would have, though they would have been prepared for this. "Hey, Midnight, he knocked me out of bounds. I'm down here." Midnight looked around in shock and stared down at the floor, nowhere near Taru. "Oh, right. Bakugou wins." Half a cure was knocked out of bounds, she yelled, hoping that Mick would hear. After a minute, Mick could be heard through the speakers. "Wait, what? Huh? Oh. Bakugou wins." Taru grabbed her clothes from where they were blown to and pulled them on, brushing ash off them first. She glanced up at Bakugou, who had started to move again. He looked angry as he turned and stormed out of the arena. Taru watched him before turning and doing the same, heading up to where the rest of the class was waiting. Bakugou wasn't there. She sat down near the entrance, not wanting to walk anymore as her legs ached. She closed her eyes and nearly went to sleep before she felt a hand tap her shoulder. She opened her eyes and squinted up at Rei and Izuku, both frowning down at her. "Did you use what happened to Izuku to try and win?" She winced and nodded slowly. Izuku was stood still, biting his nails nervously. "Rei, it's fine. I don't mind. It's not like he didn't know." Rei glared at him. No, it's not okay. What he did is serious. He's the reason you know. Well, sort of. He wasn't the only one. I was weak, and I gave up too soon. It's my fault, not his." Rei glared at him. "Izuku, you can't just blame yourself for things like this. It's not your fault. You didn't do anything wrong. It was his mistake, not yours." Izuku stared at the floor. "I know you're trying to help me, I know that. But this isn't something that can be helped. It's a mistake that's already been made, and that can't be undone. Besides, all you know is what I've told you. You don't know the whole story." Rei stopped. "What else is there?" "Izuku?" Izuku shook his head and turned around. "I'll see you at home." He didn't look back as he floated through the wall and out of the building, leaving Rei and Taru with a confused Class 1A. Izuku and Rei sat in silence as they watched the people passing below them. Every now and then, one would point up at them, saying something about vigilantes or heroes. It was a boring night. So far, nothing had happened. There had been a mugging, but a hero reached them first. Other than that, it had been a quiet night. Rei sighed and lay back on the rooftop. Why is nothing happening? This place is usually full of criminals. Izuku didn't look at her as he spoke. Something must be happening. We should keep an eye on the news, and see if anything unusual is happening near here. Rei took out her phone and opened the news. Nothing, anywhere. It's like villains are taking the night off. Wait a minute. Izuku glanced over at her phone and stared. We need to get to Hazo, now. Rei nodded and the two of them flew over buildings and across countryside, ignoring people yelling and any heroes who noticed them. Eventually, they saw the light of fires burning in the distance and heard screaming and crashing. They landed on a rooftop and looked down in horror at the scene below them. Bodies littered the streets, blood covering every inch. Broken glass covered the floor and fires raged as far as the eye could see. And, barely 100 meters away, stood a monster. Nomu, Izuku muttered, staring at the beast. The League is behind this. Rei gulped as she nodded, staring at the beast. She had managed to take down the one at the USJ, but she could barely remember anything. It had all been a blur. She probably couldn't do it again. Hey! A hero yelled up to them. What are you doing? Get out of here. Izuku looked at the hero, recognizing him as the normal hero Manuel. Taru had said that one of her classmates was interning with him. Tanya Ida, the younger brother of Ingenium, a hero who was nearly killed in this very city. Spectre, you work on evacuating citizens. Avoid a fight where you can. I'll meet you when I can. Wait, where are you? He leapt off the rooftop, flying off somewhere going. She sighed and glanced back at the Nomu, before flying off in the opposite direction. Izuku searched every dark alleyway he could find, hoping to save Taru's classmate before he made a grave mistake, or got killed. Finally, he heard someone yelling in a nearby alley and dove into it, landing between Ida and the hero killer. He smirked, holding his hand out to Stain. I'm Phantom, nice to meet you, Stain. Now, as a fellow vigilante, I'd like to request that you let the kid go. Stain pointed a knife at Izuku's throat. And why would I do that? He came to find me, with the intention to kill me. Izuku pushed the knife away. He has good reason to. I believe you attacked and almost killed his older brother. From what I heard, he has been forced into retirement. Ida stared up at the vigilante. Swan dive, BNHA, the hero killer, P.3 of 3. Silently wishing he would leave, but this vigilante had saved his life, and the lives of the rest of his class, so he wanted to, at least, be polite. Sorry, but I'm going to need you to get out of my way, Stain asked, raising his knife again. Well, I tried to be polite about it, but, if you insist. Izuku flew at Stain, who held his arms up to block, but instead of attacking, Izuku flew right through him, before turning and kicking him in the back of the head. Stain fell forward a bit before turning and rushing at the vigilante, his knives and swords passing right through. That's not going to work, Izuku said, floating in mid-air as Stain kept on attacking. You can't hit me. Izuku looked up at Ida, making eye contact, then mouthed for him to run. Ida shook his head and Izuku mouthed again. Please run, he mouthed, looking pleadingly at the hero in training. Ida, reluctantly, left the alley, but only went around the corner, ready to jump in again when he saw an opportunity. You can stop now. The kid's gone, and I have some questions for you anyway. Stain stopped attacking and checked to see that Ida had left. Izuku smiled at him. Tell me everything you know about the League of Villains. Stain glared at Izuku. I'm not telling you anything. Izuku shrugged. I guess not. He waved before floating out onto the street and grabbing Ida by the arm, pulling him along until they were far enough away from the hero killer. Why did you stop me? Ida asked. Izuku smiled down at him. Because you want to be a hero, like your brother, right? You shouldn't throw away your dream too easily, you should fight for it, that's what your brother wants you to do. Also, He chuckled slightly. Taru would kill me if I let her class rep do something like that. Izuku quickly flew off before Ida could think over what he had just said. Ida watched the vigilante as he flew off, one nose circling around his head. Hagakure knows him. Hey, Ida. Manuel spotted Ida and ran over to him. Where'd you go? Izuku and Rei were, once again, sat on a rooftop looking over the city. They are vigilantes. They do this a lot. Today had not been an uneventful day. So far, they had stopped 6 robberies, 3 assaults and 1 person who was just being an asshole. Izuku had been flying on patrols around the city for the past few hours, and had only just met up with Rei, who had been stuck at her house the entire time. Her parents had suddenly decided to start actually teaching her stuff, as they had realized they didn't have long before the provisional licensing exams, that they insisted she had to pass that year so she could start helping out of their agency, meaning she would have less time for her vigilante work. Pretty soon, Izuku was going to be working alone again. So, did you see anything? Rei asked him. She was worn out after her training. Her eyes were half closed and bloodshot, her legs just hanging simply over the edge of the roof. Izuku sat next to her, or as close as he could without sinking through the building. Yeah, but I dealt with everything. Though I did see some suspicious people heading into the League of Villains base. Rei hardly reacted, just stared at the building across the street. Oh? She said, unenthusiastically. That broker, Grin. That scarred guy who was sneaking around Endeavor's house and a high school girl with knives. He sighed and scanned the street below. The League is probably up to something. Again, we don't want anything like the USJ to happen again. Rei nodded. Yeah, we should probably keep an eye on them. She looked up at him with tired eyes. Do you mind if I go home now? I'm exhausted. Izuku smiled and nodded. Yeah, I'll watch them. You can just head home. I'll text you what I find. She smiled and nodded, standing up and waving goodbye to Izuku, jumping down into the nearest alleyway. Izuku watched her leave and sighed. Soon, this was going to be what it was like all the time. He stood up and started floating over to the bar the League used. He watched as Grin left the bar before peering in through the wall. The bar was more full than he had ever seen it. Sat at a table near the back were the 2 people Izuku had seen with Grin. There was also a man wearing a blue and white bodysuit talking to himself, a man with a top hat and orange coat, and a lizard man. They were recruiting. Izuku listened into the villains' conversation. They didn't reveal much. Shigaraki clearly didn't trust these villains much, or not enough to tell them the plan yet, anyway, but Izuku managed to get the villains' names at least. He sat there for a while, watching the villains closely. A few more villains arrived and after a while, Shigaraki did start to explain the plan. Izuku had heard about the training camp from Taru. She had been getting some extra help from him and Rei so she could pass the practical exam. She was super excited about the camp, as was the rest of the class. Which is why what Shigaraki said made his blood run cold. We're going to attack their training camp and capture this brat. He held up a photo to show the others, but Izuku couldn't see it. But he knew it must be one of Taru's classmates. Shigaraki lowered the photo and turned around, about to start talking again, but his angry red eyes met Izuku's emerald green and he glared. Izuku instinctively ducked as a glass was thrown at his face. Damn vigilante! Shigaraki hissed. Izuku floated through the floor and reappeared behind Dabi. Oh! You're the villain who was sneaking around Endeavor's house. Dabi spun around and shot fire at him. Not going to work. But a firework, huh? Interesting. I guess I now know why you were sneaking around Endeavor's. Dabi leapt at Izuku but he just sunk into the floor and reappeared next to Twice. He grabbed the villain's mask and ripped it off. Twice fell to the floor, holding his hands over his head. Muscular aimed a punch at Izuku, but it passed right through him and smashed into the wall. No, you idiots. Physical attacks don't work on him. Shigaraki yelled, but he was just ignored. Toga yelled something about him being cute and tried to stab him, nearly hitting Spinner, who pulled a sword out and swung at Izuku's head. Mustard pulled a gun out, but the bullet just ricocheted off of Moonfish's teeth. Shigaraki was still sat at the bar, his hands over his face, trying to ignore the chaos going on behind him. By this point, Izuku had left the bar and was floating in the sky above the city, texting Rei. She wasn't responding, so he presumed she had fallen asleep. He texted Taru to make sure, and she confirmed it for him, saying that she was still training for the final exams, that were only 2 days away. He asked her to send him the location of the training camp as soon as she could, but didn't tell her why. She was stressed enough over the exams, he didn't want to stress her anymore. He floated back home, knowing that Rei wouldn't be there, like she normally was. She was back at her parents', so they didn't notice her absence, not that they ever had before. He made his way to his room, glancing up at the All Might poster above his bed, the only hero merch he had taken with him. He changed out of his vigilante costume, folding it neatly under his bed and pulled on some pajamas, making his way downstairs. He tried watching a film, but it was too quiet. Without Rei there, he probably just had to get used to it. Rei was passed out on the sofa when Izuku came home from patrols. Once again, she had been training with her parents. It was lucky she had managed to get away for long enough to head home. Izuku grabbed a blanket that she had dumped on the side and gently lay it on her, before heading to his room to change out of his costume. Rei had been training with her parents almost every day for the past few weeks, so he hadn't managed to tell her about everything he heard at the bar, not face to face, and they avoided putting too much information in texts anyway. He stopped off at her room on his way back downstairs to grab a teddy from her room. He knew how much she loved it, even if she claimed she didn't. She and Taru were given matching teddies for their first birthday, and Rei had made sure to keep hers safe. Taru probably had as well, but Izuku was too awkward to ask. Patrols still felt weird without Rei, even if it had now been weeks since he had even seen her. He didn't think he would ever get used to it. He had briefly considered trying to team up with another vigilante, but he didn't want to replace Rei. She meant the world to him. He floated into the kitchen and grabbed a plate from the cupboard and started digging around, looking for ingredients. Rei loved pancakes, as Izuku had learned from having to clear up after she had decided she wanted some at 3 a.m. In her defense, if he could eat, he would do it all the time. He checked to make sure she was still asleep and started mixing the ingredients. Rei started to wake up just as he finished cooking them. "Hey, Rei." He walked over to her and handed her the plate. She took it gratefully and started to eat, peering up at him through lidded eyes, though she was still smiling, despite her clear exhaustion. "Hey, Izuku, did you miss me?" He laughed and she shifted over to let him sit down next to her on the sofa. "So, Taru said that you had some fun when you went to the villain's base. Something about causing complete and utter chaos?" Izuku grinned and started explaining what happened. Rei laughed and smiled widely, seeming to forget her exhaustion. She had missed Izuku so much over the few weeks they had been apart, and was glad to see him again, but part of her was afraid of what would happen when she had leave again. Maybe even for good. "So where is Taru?" "That training camp is soon, right?" Rei looked at him, shaking herself from her stupor and nodded. "It started yesterday, I think." "I was too tired to notice." Izuku stiffened. "It's already started?" He grabbed his phone from his pocket and attempted to call Taru. "Hey, this is Taru Hagakure. Just leave a message after the beep. Tell." He cursed to himself and tried again. "Hey, this is Taru Hagakure. Just leave a message after the beep." He checked through all the messages she had sent him and managed to find the one he was searching for. "Oh, and the training camps with the wild pussycats, BTW." He checked the news for anything about the pussycats or the training camp but found nothing. Maybe there was no signal there? That could be it. But then Izuku remembered what the villains had said. They were planning to attack the training camp. Taru could be in danger. "Rei, we need to go." Taru isn't picking up her phone. "Huh?" Rei questioned. "It'll be nothing bad, just no signal, or maybe they were forced to turn off their phones." Izuku had already grabbed his costume from the side. He always kept a spare where he could grab it, and was pulling it on top of his pajamas. The villains were planning on attacking the camp. "Their aim is to capture one of the students." Rei looked confused, but after a second realization crossed his face. "Oh, she sprang up from her seat and grabbed her costume from the table as well, forcing it on. "You don't think it's Taru, is it? If something happened to her because I wasn't paying attention." Izuku was ready, but he just grabbed a few spare knives off of the side, tucking them into his belt and taking his phone out, to try and call Taru once more. She didn't pick up. Unlikely. They probably want to turn the person, so they'd want someone openly hostile, no clear connections or loyalties to a hero, previous villainous behavior. "Oh shit, they'll be after Kaken." Ray looked up at Izuku. "Wait, we have to save that asshole. Can't we just leave him?" Izuku tried not to laugh. This really wasn't the time. "No. We can't show any bias. Anyone else and we'd try to save them. We can't show a dislike to any one student. Also, I thought you were the hero." Ray stuck her tongue out. "Nah, you're more of a hero than me. All Might's not nothing on you." Izuku smiled at her as she finished putting on her shoes and stood up. She looked up at him and smiled widely. "Time to be heroes. Hagakure, please follow me," Aizawa ordered. It was the third day of the training camp and Taru had been in the middle of her quirk training. She hadn't heard from Ray since she had left, but Ray was probably too exhausted to do much. Izuku had been texting her daily, asking about how the training was going and what they were doing. She had given him the best explanation she could, though she had been too tired to really think about it. She followed after Aizawa, who led her to the classroom in the building. She sat down on one of the desks and looked up at her teacher. Ida was sat at the back of the classroom, looking slightly guilty. What had he done? Hagakure. Toei looked back at Aizawa, noticing the firm look he was giving her. "Do you know the Vigilante's Phantom and Spectre?" She resisted the urge to look back at Ida. Had he found out somehow? Izuku said he had met him at Hazo. Maybe he had said something to him then. There was no other way Ida could know anything. "I know of them. They're getting to be quite well known. Despite being vigilantes, they were also at the USJ." Aizawa narrowed his eyes. "Really? Because one of them claimed to know you." At least Taru didn't have to keep a straight face. Being invisible did have its perks. "Really? Well, he did help me after I was attacked by that Nomu at the USJ. I owe my life to him." Aizawa looked up at Ida. "Apparently, they called you by your first name, and what they said suggests that they are in contact with you." She was so going to yell at Izuku for this. Not to mention, they could find out about Ray if he wasn't already dead. "Our full names are publicly available. They were included in the reports on the USJ attack, and he is not in contact with me. He was probably just making it up." Aizawa looked down at her, a sad look crossing his face. "So you do know them?" If Taru's face could be seen, it would be a picture of confusion. Aizawa seemed to realize this as he went on to explain. "You said he. I never mentioned which one it was. Since you are using male pronouns, you must know that I'm talking about Phantom, rather than Spectre, who was female." Taru opened her mouth to speak but closed it again when she realized she had no way to respond to that. Izuku was so fucked when she got back. "Now, tell me what you know about them." "No," Taru yelled, her invisible eyes meeting her teacher's. "I'm not telling you anything about them. They haven't done anything wrong. They're just trying to help people." "What's so wrong with that? They have saved so many people, including our entire class. I'm not going to betray them like that." Aizawa sighed. "You realize that the police will want to question you? You will have to tell them what you know." She crossed her arms and glared at him. "If I can't keep it secret forever, then I will buy them as much time as I can. I won't tell you anything more than the fact that they are good people who want to save people. They do what they do out of kindness and a will to help others. They are heroes in my eyes. Even if not legally. I see no reason why they should be stopped. I will not be the reason for them to stop." Aizawa looked down at his student. Even if he couldn't see her, he knew the expression that would be on her face. One that's strong and determined to protect the people she cares about. "Fine. I won't tell the police. I don't see any reason to go after them anyway. However, if I ever see them, it is my duty as a hero to apprehend them. They save lives and I see no reason to stop them. You and Ida can go now." Taru stood up and quickly bowed. "Thank you." Ida followed after her, looking slightly relieved. She turned and looked at him. "Hey, maybe don't tell anyone else about this, okay?" "Fandom was an idiot for telling you in the first place." He nodded and she pulled her phone out, sending a text to Izuku before heading back out to continue her training. For the test of courage, Taru was paired with Jiru. The pair were sent in after Bakugou and Todoroki. "Hey, Jiru, we need to be faster. I want to see how Bakugou and Todoroki react," Taru yelled, dancing about, and Jiru followed along behind her. "It probably won't be anything exciting." Taru grabbed her arm and started pulling her along. "Hey, let go." Taru just laughed. "Come on, it'll be fun." Jiru just shrugged her off and continued walking. They were in silence for the next few minutes before Jiru finally spoke. "Hey, can you smell that?" Taru sniffed the air. "Yeah, what is it?" "It smells like some kind of gas," she said before bending over, coughing. Jiru ran over to her, putting her hand over her mouth as Taru did the same. "We need to get out of here." Her voice started to train off as she felt her consciousness slipping. They needed to run, but her legs felt like they were made of lead. SH just wanted to curl up in a ball and go to sleep. Taru was the first to collapse. She fell to the floor in a heap. Jiru grabbed her by the hand and tried to drag her away, but it won't long before she collapsed as well, the only thing she could hear being the incessant ringing of Taru's phone. Izuku was the first one to see the blue flames that engulfed the forest. He started flying faster towards where the flames had originated but heard Rei start coughing behind him. "Gas," she said, between coughs. Pink gas was swirling below them. Izuku appeared through the fog and spotted someone, unconscious on the floor. "I'll get her and defeat the villain. You go get anyone else and send them back to that building over there." "Defeat any villains you see." Rei nodded, her hand over her mouth. Izuku flew down into the fog, landing next to the girl. She had purple hair and earphone jacks dangling from her ears. He went to pick her up but noticed Taru's unconscious form beside her. He gritted his teeth. His quirk made it impossible to pick them both up at the same time. He looked up and gazed though into the center in the fog and glanced back at the two girls lying on the floor. He flew through the fog, glancing around for the villain. He heard a shout from deep in the fog and flew to where the sound originated. Two students were fighting the villain. He didn't recognize them, so he presumed they were from Class 1B. He waited until they had the villain distracted and ran in, punching the villain in the back of the head. The villain fell to the floor and Izuku pinned him down, handing the unconscious villain. The two students looked up at the vigilante through the dispersing fog. "I'm Phantom. If you two head in that direction," he pointed back where he had come from, "you'll find two others. Take them back to the building. Get back to your teachers." He left before the two of them could respond. He floated high above the forest, watching the trees carefully, hoping to see a villain or students to save. A scream echoed from a cliff, overlooking the forest. A child's scream. He flew, as quick as he could, to the cliff and saw a young boy wearing a red cap, crawling away from a villain, covered in muscle. He solidified his feet and flew at the villain, kicking him hard in the face. The villain barely reacted and turned back to Izuku, ignoring the child. "Huh. You're that vigilante." He smiled widely. "I can kill you." The villain ran at him, but he just passed through Izuku. He kept on attacking, and just passing through Izuku. Izuku knew he couldn't attack. He wasn't strong enough to fight the villain by himself. Unless Izuku watched the villain attack again. He had thought of this attack month ago but had never attempted it. Mostly because it would kill the person he used it on. He glanced at the child, who watched him with fear and hope, both swirling in his eyes. Izuku turned back to the villain. He had to save the boy. He reached his hand out, passing through the man's skin and solidified his hand around the man's heart. He clamped his eyes shut as he squeezed the muscle beneath his hand. All he had to do was to get his heartbeat out of rhythm. The man grabbed at his chest and gritted his teeth. Izuku squeezed again and the man fell to his knees, screaming as pain erupted in his chest. Izuku let go and removed his hand, watching as the man fell to the floor and stopped breathing. He had killed him. What did you so?" the boy asked. Izuku shook himself from his stupor and looked at the boy, wiping his hand on his clothes. I gave him a heart attack." Izuku looked back up at the boy and smiled weakly. "Come here, I'll carry you back to the heroes." Are you a hero?" Izuku shook his head sadly. "No, well, not a pro hero at least." "Now, Come on, let's get you to safety. Rei flew over the forest, carrying 4 students with her tentacles. She had found a ginger girl and a silver-haired boy trying to carry Taru and one of her classmates through the forest and had offered her help. The 2 had been reluctant to accept help from a vigilante but had eventually decided that they needed help if they were going to save the unconscious girls. Rei landed in front of the building and lowered the 4 to the floor. A familiar black-haired hero was stood there, stomping on a puddle of brown-gray sludge. "Sorry we're late, erase your head, but me and Phantom are now here to help," she said, smiled at him. "Should I put these 2 inside?" She indicated to the 2 passed-out students lying on the floor between them. Aizawa nodded and Rei moved the 2 inside. She then turned back to Aizawa. "Do you know where Confronting Bakugou is, by any chance?" "We have reason to believe that the villains are here to kidnap him." "Well, they're here to kidnap someone. Most likely Bakugou." Aizawa turned to her. "You should go and find Mandalay. She can get the message out. I'll stay here to protect the students. Send any you find this way." Rei nodded. From what Izuku had said during his fanboy moments, Mandalay was one of the wild pussycats. Her quirk was telepath, so she could broadcast the message to the whole class at once. She lifted herself into the air and looked around for the hero, and saw a commotion in a nearby clearing. 2 villains had taken a hero, Ragdoll, hostage and the rest of the pussycats were facing them. "You must be Mandalay," Rei said, landing next to her. "I'm Spectre. Can you send a message out that the villains are targeting Confronting Bakugou aka Kaken, please?" Baku sure to add the Kaken bit. "It should make it easier for us to find him." Mandalay gave her a questioning look but broadcast the message anyway. Rei thanked her then turned back to the 2 villains. Izuku had gathered info about all of the villains he had seen in the base, so she knew plenty about the brown-haired one Magn, aka Kinji Hikushi. Her quirks makes people into magnets. Men are South Poles, women are North. Range 4.5 meters, she said, recalling everything Izuku had told her on the way there. Lizard 1 is Spinner, aka Shuichi Agachi. His quirk is called Gecko. Basically, he can walk on walls. Huge Stain fanboy, hence the knives and swords. Mandalay nodded. "Ideas on how to get Ragdoll back?" Rei thought for a second. "Separate Magna and Spinner. Get him out of her range. Magn's female so can't attract Ragdoll to herself. I can then call Phantom. Her quirk doesn't work on him." Mandalay nodded and Rei grabbed her phone, sending her location to Izuku. Rei used her tentacles to grab Spinner and hold him upside down in the air, holding him firmly in place. There were a few seconds of silence as Magn considered her next move before Izuku came barreling out of the trees behind her, knocking her off of Ragdoll and pinning her to the floor. Rei grabbed Ragdoll and brought her over to them, lowering her into Mandalay's arms. Izuku looked up at Rei. "Any sign of Bakugou?" Rei shook her head. "Nothing yet. We just have to hope they haven't caught him yet. The best thing would be if he made it back to Aizawa." Izuku nodded, punching Mange across the face as she tried to squirm out of his grip. "We'll continue looking." "Oh, and Mandalay, is that your kid?" He pointed to a young boy, who he had learned was called Koda, who was stood, hiding behind the trees. Mandalay's face lit up. "Koda, you're alright." The boy burst into tears and ran over to her, wrapping his arms around her as Tiger took Ragdoll from Mandalay. "I Phantom, got any handcuffs?" "I left mine in my other costume." Izuku looked up at her. "I put mine on that gas villain." Rei looked up at Spinner, still struggling desperately against her tentacles, then over at Magn, still trying to use her quirk on Izuku. "It only works on living people." Then back at Mandalay, still hugging Koda to her as he sobbed. "Well, great. Looks like we have to knock them out. They'll probably wake up before the cops get here." "Brilliant." Spinner started grabbing at something at his throat, trying to pull it off. After a minute, he stopped moving and Rei dropped him to the floor. Izuku grabbed Mange's face and slammed her head into the floor. She stopped struggling and he stood up again, floating over to Rei. "Hey, Rei, I had to use that move on one of the villains." Rei grew pale. "Oh, are you okay?" He nodded slowly. "Come on, We have to find Bakugou. Rei's eyes flickered open and she saw a familiar ceiling above her head. She could hear someone's slow breathing next to her. She slowly twisted her head but saw no one there. Taru. She managed to say, and she heard what she presumed was Taru waking up. Huh, Rei, you're awake. We were worried. Do you remember what happened? Rei closed her eyes and thought for a second. She and Izuku had rushed off into the forest to find Bakugou. They had found him and Todoroki fighting Moonfish. They had started to escort them back to the heroes when Mr. Compress had kidnapped Bakugou. The three had run after the villains to get Bakugou back and had succeeded in freeing another aunt of Taru's classmates before villains attacked them. The villains ambushed us. Wait. She bolted upright. Did they get Bakugou, or anyone else? How long has it been? Where is Izuku? Taru put her hands on Rei's arm, trying to calm her down. It's okay. They did get Bakugou, but no one else. It was just last night. Izuku's downstairs making you breakfast. Rei nodded slowly and gave Taru a relieved smile. What about Bakugou? We have to save him. We should act as soon as possible. Tonight. She started trying to stand up but Taru held her in her bed. The door opened and Izuku entered, carrying a plate of food and a steaming mug. He smiled at Rei and placed the mug on her bedside table, giving Rei the plate. One of Taru's classmates placed a tracker on one of the Nomus that escaped. Taru will talk to her and see if we can get a receiver to follow the tracker. Rei took the plate from him and nodded slowly. Good. I hate to say it, but I don't want that asshole to be hurt. From his announcement at the sports festival, he must be at least trying to change. She smiled up at Izuku, who looked thoughtful as he stared at the wall. He could be a great hero one day. Yeah. Taru's voice echoed from the opposite side of the room. And, besides, I still need to apologize for what I said at the sports festival. So you have to save him. Rei stuck her tongue out at where Taru's voice had come from. Not going to help us, then? Taru scoffed. I'm getting the receiver for you. The two sisters glared for a minute before both bursting into laughter. Taru joined her class on their visit to the hospital. They wanted to visit the people who had been injured in the attack, from both classes. But it was clear that wasn't all that was on their minds. Kirishima hung towards the back of the group, staying silent most of the time. The rest of Bakugou's friends were also quieter than usual. Sero and Mina hung quiet near the back as well, glancing over at Kirishima every few seconds to make sure he was okay. Kaminari was at the front of the group, trying to help cheer people up, but when he wasn't doing that, he would just stand there in deathly silence. Taru slowly gravitated towards Kirishima, unable to stand the sadness rolling off of him for much longer. He looked up when he felt her hand on his shoulder and stared for a second, not speaking. Eventually, she had to break the silence. You know, I may or may not know some people who can help us get Bakugou back, and they may or may not be planning it right now. For a second, hope seemed to glimmer in Kirishima's eyes. Taru smiled slightly. Could you maybe come with me? I need to get a receiver from Yorazu. I have a sneaking suspicion you want one as well. Kirishima's eyes opened wider and he smiled, genuinely for a moment. Receiver for what? A tracker she placed on one of the Nomu that should lead right back to the League's base. She took her hand off of his shoulder, and he suspected she was smirking. Being invisible has its perks. You overhear a lot of stuff, and with that, she and Kirishima slowly maneuvered their way out of the room, somehow without Sero or Mina noticing, but they would probably realize soon enough. She led him down the corridor to Yorazu's room and peered in. Seeing no one inside, she pushed the door open. Yorazu looked up at them and offered a weak smile. Taru and Kirishima made their way over to her bed, closing the door gently behind them. Kirishima started. I want a receiver. I have to help Bakugou. Taru stopped him and looked down at Yorazu. She and Izuku had gone over what she should say to her before Tad woken up, so she was ready. I know the two vigilantes who were at the USJ and the training camp attack. Yorazu and Kirishima stared at her in shock. If you give me a receiver, then I can make sure they get it and are made aware of the base's location. They will be able to assist in Bakugou's rescue. I can assure you, they are trustworthy, Even if vigilantism isn't technically legal, they are good people and will try their best to save Bakugou. Everything was silent for a minute, then Kirishima spoke. It's not enough. Taru looked over at him. It's my fault that Bakugou was kidnapped. I tried to find him, but I couldn't. I couldn't help him, so I have to help him now. I have to go, and I have to try my best. Do everything I can to save him. Just giving them the tracker isn't enough. I have to be there. I have to try. Yes, I agree, came a voice. Taru and Kirishima turned around to see Ida and Todoroki standing by the door. We'll help as well. Taru smiled and looked down at Yorikazu. Okay, I'll make 2 receivers. Hagakure can give one to Phantom and so Hector, we can use the other. Taru nodded. Okay, though. I maybe won't tell them what we're planning. They'll find a way to stop us. So, where are we meeting? Taru was the last to reach the meeting spot. Sorry, she called, approaching the others. I had to wait till Spectre left. She would think something was up if she saw me leave. Yaozu gave her a soft smile and Ida nodded. Todoroki, however, gave her a confused look, by which I mean he slightly raised one of his eyebrows. Do you live with her? He asked, his voice blank and emotionless. Taru ignored him and turned to the others. So, let's go then. Yorikazu nodded and looked down at the receiver in the hands. It's in Kamino Ward. That's about 2 hours train journey from here. Taru nodded slightly. Spectre and Phantom will probably get there just before us then. Spectre was wearing casual clothes when she left, so she and Phantom will probably be taking the train as well. Kirishima stepped forward. Then we need to go. We have to be there when they make their move. The 4 of them nodded and started their journey. Their mission to save Bakugou. I hate trains, Taru muttered as they left the platform at Kamino. I always get squished. How far are we? Kirishima asked, turning to Yorikazu. He had been asking almost constantly the entire journey. Taru understood his concern, but even Todoroki was starting to look borderline annoyed. Not far. We can easily walk from here. The only problem will be people recognizing us. Taru looked over at the others and had to agree. Though she could easily get away unseen, they would stand out in the area of town they were heading to. Yeah. You guys get disguises. You can borrow my clothes if you need to. Hey, Yorikazu can make stuff for us. Yorikazu nodded, though she did sadly glance over at a nearby clothing store. I'll get to work. Just a few minutes later, and everybody was dressed in their new clothes. Taru took one look at them and burst out laughing. Well, I guess we won't be recognized, she managed to say between snorts of laughter. But you guys sort of look like idiots. Ida was fiddling with his new suspenders as Kirishima flicked the strange horns stuck onto his head. Yorikazu had barely changed. She was just wearing a fancy dress. Todoroki was the only one who was well disguised. Not that anyone would be staring at them enough to recognize them anyway. Come on, let's go, she called. The others hadn't realized how far she had gone already and quickly scrambled after her. It was this way, right? An agreement was made that Taru should hold Yorikazu's hand at all times so that they didn't lose her, and the 5 made their way through the packed streets of Kamino. Gradually, the streets became less lively, the people dispersing as they delved deeper into the darkest regions. Taru started to shiver as the air felt colder and more sinister. Eventually, they stopped seeing people at all. They seemed to be the only people navigating the shifting maze of buildings. Taru squeezed Yorikazu's hand slightly, resulting herself that there were other people there with her, that she hadn't been abandoned in the cold and dark. It's here, Yorikazu almost whispered, pointing to a warehouse across the street from them. Taru let go of her hand and peered into the alleyway next to the building, seeing 2 figures standing towards the back of the building. She whispered to the others to wait as she approached the 2, seeing their figures becoming more distinct as they looked closer through the fog. Eventually, she heard 2 familiar voices. This is the right place, right? Are you sure you're not reading that wrong? Yeah, Ray, I'm sure this is the place, though it does look a bit abandoned. Izuku and Ray stood there, peering over the wall, both dressed in their vigilante costumes. More than a bit, and I haven't heard any yelling. These walls don't look soundproof, and if Bakugou's anything like you described, good point. Maybe I should float inside. Have a look. Someone could see you. I don't know. I don't have any night vision goggles so I can't see inside. Taru cleared her throat. I think Kirishima has some. Izuku squealed slightly and sunk into the floor, and Rei took a fighting stance, staring into the empty space before them. After a moment, Rei sighed and relaxed. Taru, what are you doing here? Same as you, I'd imagine. Oh, and I have some friends with me. You can come. It's okay. Kirishima was the first to enter. He made his way down the alley until he saw Izuku and Rei standing there. The others followed him and spotted the two vigilantes stood there as well. Taru, why are they here? People aren't supposed to know we know each other. Rei sighed. Well, I told Yorazu to get the receiver and someone told Ida. Izuku had reappeared from the floor and looked slightly guilty as he looked over at Ida. Wait. Who told him? I didn't. I'm guessing you didn't either. Something seemed to click in Rei's brain and she turned to Izuku. Izuku, why would you tell him? Do you want me to get caught? Izuku backed away. Why, you just used my actual name in front of them. Now I'm going to get caught. Toei snorted. For two vigilantes, you are awful at the whole secret identities thing. Should we just tell them who you are and get it other with number? The two responded together. What is going on here? Kirishima asked from behind Taru. She turned and looked at him. You brought the night vision goggles, right? Oh, yeah. Kirishima pulled them from his pocket and handed them to Taru, who passed them on to Rei. Rei put the goggles on and peered through the window into the warehouse. I don't think Bakugou will be here. Looks more like a Nomu factory than a headquarters. Izuku took the goggles from her and had a look as well. Yeah, I agree. We should have checked the bar first. Rei groaned. But that's in the complete opposite direction. I can't fly that far. That's another 3 hours on a train. You know where their base is? Totoroku asked. Why didn't you go there? Izuku looked down at the students, surprise crossing his face. He had forgotten they were there. The League knows that we know where their base is, so it's unlikely they would take him there, since we would get there quickly. This seemed more likely as no one knew where it was. Totoroki nodded. Then should one of you go to either one? Izuku looked at Rei. Why didn't we think of that? I feel like an idiot. Rei face-palmed. Should have done that. We've been doing this for more than a year, and he thought of that strategy before us. Well, guess we can't change it now. Who says we just break into this warehouse anyway? All in favor say aye. Crash. Something crushed the warehouse, sending debris flying. The students were pushed back by the force of it. Only Izuku was unaffected. The heroes are here, he yelled, loud enough for the others to hear over the crashing that filled the air. I can see that. Rei yelled back to him, staring at the destroyed warehouse. We better hope Bakugou wasn't in there. The hero students regained their footing and peered back over the wall. The building had been flattened, only the back half of it remained. Heroes swarmed inside, looking for any sign of the villains. One of them spotted Ragdoll and rushed over to her, carrying her out of the ruins so she could be healed. Izuku recognized all of the heroes swarming the building. Some of them he had met himself, if being chased by them counts as meeting them. However, he didn't recognize the man who stumbled out of the rubble. A black steel mask covered his face, wires and tubes snaking out of it and into the darkness he had emerged from. He wore a suit, neat and tidy. Despite the chaos that surrounded him, the students backed away, praying the man didn't notice them. None of them knew who he was, but even so, he sent a shiver through them, down to their bone marrow. They watched, horrified, as the heroes were defeated, one by one or all at once they couldn't tell, each defeat blending together in their trembling minds. They hardly noticed as black sludge spilt out onto the dirt, their eyes focused on the man. Izuku was the first to notice. He gently tapped Rei's shoulder and pointed at it, the others looking over as well. Shapes began to emerge from the sludge. Fiery blue eyes, glimmering knives, stained red, bony fingers, scraping at bloody skin, and an explosion of pale blonde hair. Bakugou stood amongst the League, red eyes fixed on the man stood above him, hands ready to attack at a moment's notice. Izuku took a shaky breath, fear flooding his body. and turned to the others. We have to get Bakugou. Ray nodded. This will probably be the best chance we have. They'll probably get out of here as quickly as they can. We have to act now. The others nodded, some more reluctantly than others. Izuku glanced over at Bakugou, then back at the students surrounding him. Right. Okay. Izuku thought for a second, then glanced around the others again. Todoroki, make a nice ramp. Ida, you'll be our engines. The rest of you have to hang on. Our Spectre can use her quirk to pick Bakugou up and to break the wall. What about you? Ray asked. What are you doing? Izuku looked at her with a small smile. I'm the diversion. Bakugou looked around the villains, hoping to see a way out. The villains were listening to the masked man who glared down at them. Oh! Shigaraki, came a shout from behind him. You'll never guess who it is. Shigaraki turned around and glared. Vigilante brat, he yelled, but he didn't move. The other villains turned to glare at the small vigilante. Some of them started getting their weapons and one burst into blue flame, but Shigaraki didn't move. So this is Sensei? That mask looks like a life support to me. Did he just look at you for too long? Shigaraki flipped the vigilante off but still didn't move to attack. He moved closer and closer and closer until he was floating right in front of the villain's crumbling face. Do you want some lotion? The villain's hand shot out and he tried to grab the boy's face, but he flew back and past Shigaraki, flying circled around the other villains, who each attempted to grab him. He flew high above the group and shouted something Bakugou couldn't quite hear. There was a crash as the wall to the side collapsed and a group of people shot into the sky. Something wrapped around Bakugou's chest and he was pulled into the sky, dangling behind the group of people flying through the sky. Phantom flew after them and ended up flying next to Bakugou, more to catch him if he fell than anything. They slowly started to fall again and Ray slowed their fall. They landed in an alleyway. Bakugou felt the grip on his chest release as his feet touched the floor and he looked up at the group that saved him. Kirishima, Todoroki, Ida, Yorazu, Taru, who had gotten dressed again, and the two vigilantes. He looked over at the vigilantes but Phantom quickly turned away from him, making conversation with Ida instead. What has happened to your voice? Ida asked. It was higher earlier. And nothing, Phantom almost whispered. It was a miracle Ida even heard him. Hey, someone else started talking to Phantom. Kirishima, thank you for doing that to save Bakugou. I owe you. Izuku, right? Phantom waves his hands in front of him. Please. Just call me Phantom. Izuku? Bakugou glared at the back of Phantom's head. Izuku gulped as he heard Bakugou take a step closer. The blonde approached until Izuku could hear his breathing just inches from his neck. Deku? Izuku stiffened and Ray watched them carefully. She wanted to help, but this was a problem Izuku would have to solve himself. Kaken, Izuku said, his hands tightening into fists, his face quickly pulling. Bakugou practically shoved Kirishima away, moving so he was stood in front of the ghost boy. Izuku flipped his hood down and removed his mask and wig. Green hair burst free, emerald eyes glittering and pale skin almost glowing in the pale moonlight. Bakugou's face was unreadable. He stared at Izuku with a face that didn't change yet seemed to be constantly shifting through every emotion Izuku knew. You bastard. Bakugou's face finally landed on rage. I thought you were dead. They told me you were dead. That you jumped off a fucking rooftop. Do you have any fucking idea what the last year was like for me? What you put me through? Huh? You motherfucker. You bastard. Do you know what you've done? I went to your fucking funeral. You piece of shit Deku. It's been a fucking year. An entire fucking year. Do you know what that year was like? For me. For your mom. For anyone who knew you. Shut the fuck up, Kaken. Bakugou's face dropped and he stepped back from the boy who stood there, seething with rage. Do you know what the last 10 years have been like for me? Waking up every day in a cold sweat, being terrified to go to school, coming home covered in cut and bruises, having nothing and no one there for me, being told every day that I'm worthless, that my dreams will never come true. You were lucky. You were always lucky. You were strong. No one ever looked down on you. People worshipped you. But me, I was worthless, useless, weak, quirkless Deku. A straight tear rolled down Bakugou's cheek, but he didn't seem to notice. He just stared at the boy before him at Deku. And, by the way, Kaken, I did. Bakugou took a minute to respond. You did what? Izuku's eyes met his. Jump. Bakugou took a step back. N number. You're here. You can't have jumped. Izuku looked down at his feet. I met All Might that day. I met my hero. It was on that rooftop that I asked him a question. I asked him if I could be a hero. He told me no, and it was too much. I had had my hopes and dreams crushed so much and I couldn't take it. So I jumped, but it turned out I wasn't quirkless after all. I guess your advice was right after all. Take a swan dive off the roof and hope you'll be born with a quirk in your next life. Rei stepped forward and held her hand out to Izuku. He gratefully took it. She looked up at Bakugou and narrowed her eyes. Rei Hagakure. That's my name, in case you were wondering. You probably weren't, but I just thought I should tell you. Why would you tell me? Rei smiled up at him. I thought you might want to know the name of the person who will beat your ass if you do anything to Izuku. He's my best friend and I owe him more than I could ever hope to pay back. The least I can do is protect him. Sorry for kicking you that one time in the alleyway as well. He looked at the two of them and nodded slowly, not sure what else to say. Rei looked down at Izuku and sighed. I'll call Mario. Izuku and Rei sat on their sofa, watching the TV. They were watching footage of the fight between All Might and All for One, for what was probably the 100th time. Taru pushed the front door open and looked over at them. She had just finished school. Rei had been let off of her training for a few days to let the news of All Might's retirement settle in. Izuku watched the footage with a apolitical eye. All Might's quirk. What was it? For the last few years, All Might had only worked for 3 hours a day and this had been getting even shorter, suggesting his quirk was weakening. But that's not how quirks worked. A quirk that got weaker over time. What sort of quirk could that be? He still remembered that day on the rooftop, when he met All Might for the first, and last, time in his life. His injury could have kick-started the weakening, but it had been constant for 5 years. Why would it suddenly get weaker again? Hey, Izuku, were you listening to me? Izuku looked over at Taru. Huh? Taru sighed. I said that Ida, Yo or Azu, Todoroki and Kirishima want to come over tomorrow. They want to be able to thank you properly for helping them save Bakugou, despite your relationship with him. Izuku nodded, starting to drift off again into thought. The time he started weakening again was soon after he started teaching at BNHA, but he was still teaching there, so he must be aware of what is weakening him or he would have stopped it or left to work on the number one hero. Why had he started teaching at in the first place? Surely a hero of his strength would be better doing hero work, not to mention his time limit would barely cover his classes, so he had a very good reason for going there. Was there any students that might be important to him? Someone he would want to look over? Mario. His quirk was permeation, but during the sports festival he had used something else. Something that looked suspiciously like a strength enhancement quirk. Like All Might's quirk. Could quirks be passed on? Is that possible? It was possible that there was a quirk that could be passed on from person to person. Izuku was literally a ghost. Rei had tentacles and Taru was invisible. Things that were once impossible. So why couldn't a quirk be passed on? How crazy could it be? Hey, Rei. I'm going to call Mario. Huh? Rei ripped her eyes away from the TV. Why? Izuku dug his phone out of his pocket and scrolled through to Mario and called him. I have a theory that I want to test out. Mario picked up and his voice seemed as happy as it always was. Hey, Izuku. What is it? Izuku took a deep breath. You have a second quirk, don't you? One you got from All Might. Mario's voice wavered. What are you talking about? Quirks can't be passed on. That doesn't make sense. Mario, I'm a ghost. Try and tell me that makes sense. Mario paused and sighed. Fair enough. Are you home? Izuku told him he was. I'll be there in 5 minutes. There was a knock on the door and Izuku ran to open it. Is it Mario? Rei yelled from the kitchen. She and Taru were attempting to cook something, preferably without getting food poisoning. Izuku opened the window and looked through the gap, seeing Mario stood there, looking nervous. Yep, he yelled to Rei, opening the door fully. Mario wasn't surprised when he saw Izuku. When they had met, Izuku had been disguised as Azumi Midori, but he had explained it to Mario already, saying he knew someone at who he wanted to avoid and that Rei had forced him into it. Mirio stepped inside and peered around. Izuku pointed him to the lounge and ran to get him a drink. Taru gasped when she saw him. "You're that third year who stripped and beat up the whole class." "Wait, what?" Rei walked into the room, holding a bowl of ice cream. She had given up cooking. It had turned black anyway. "I need to hear this story." "Oh, I'm Taru Hagakure, by the way." "Rei's my sister." A strangely finger-shaped hole appeared in Rei's ice cream and some was scooped out. "Taru, get your own ice cream, and stop eating it with your fingers." Taru groaned. "Fine, Mom." "Do you want any, Mirio?" "You can have any, but not the honeycomb. That is mine and I will kill anyone who lays a finger on it." Rei threatened. "She's not joking either," Izuku said, carrying Mirio's drink. "She once broke Taru's finger over her ice cream." It was difficult to explain it to Recovery Girl. Mirio took his drink and looked around at the three of them, then back at Izuku. "We need to talk about what you said on the phone." "How did you figure it out?" Izuku stiffened then sat down next to Mirio, gazing sadly at the floor. "For the last 5 years, All Might has only fought for 3 hours a day, due to his injury. However, this slowly decreased again after he joined up. I remembered how you seemed to be unusually strong during the sports festival and put 2 and 2 together." Mirio sipped his drink and nodded at Izuku. "But how do you know about his injury?" Izuku stiffened and clenched his fists, memories of his last day passing through his mind. "I met him once. I caught him at the wrong time and saw him transform. He gave me a quick explanation." Izuku felt the need to cry, but he knew it was useless. He couldn't cry anymore. "That was right before I died." At the mention of his death, Rei paled and walked over to him, holding her hand out to him. He smiled gratefully and took it. "Oh, you should probably talk to All Might, so he knows that you know his secret." Izuku nodded. "Yeah, if he could sort that out, that would be great." The group fell into silence again, but only a few seconds later a beeping sound could be heard. "Fuck," Rei yelled, running to her computer. "Shit, Izuku, we need to go." "Villain attacking downtown." "Why now?" Izuku grabbed his costume off of the table and pulled it on, using his quirk to be faster. Rei grabbed hers and ran into the toilet. Coming out a minute later, Mirio stood up and stared at them. "Wait, you two are vigilantes?" Izuku blinked at him. "Yes, but we're vigilantes who really need to go. There are lives to save. Please don't tell anyone." Eraserhead already knows, and he's gone with it. See you later." Rei burst through the front door and Izuku floated through the wall, both heading off to save whoever needed them. Taru sighed, watching Mirio as he stared at the wall where Izuku had disappeared. "They really need to get better at hiding their identities." Izuku floated up towards the roof of the arena. He peered over the edge. The arena was split into different areas. He could see an area filled with buildings and another was filled with boulders. It reminded him of the USJ, other than the seats that lined the walls, filled with different pro heroes and teachers. At the opposite side of the arena, he'd see 3 familiar faces. Rei's parents, Marine and Zero, were sat next to Aizawa and appeared to be chatting about something. Izuku slowly floated around to that side of the arena and through the wall. He floated down to the seats where the 3 heroes sat, now with M's joke having joined them, trying to make it look like he was walking. Can I sit here?" The 4 heroes turned to him as he pointed to a seat next to Aizawa. Aizawa seemed to glance around at the other empty seat around them. Sorry if I'm disturbing, but I recognized you. You're Rei and Taru's parents, right?" Zero's face seemed to light up. "You must be Izuku Midoriya. Rei tells about you a lot. I wasn't aware you knew Taru as well, but she's hardly home nowadays, with the dorms and everything." Aizawa seemed to have narrowed his eyes at Izuku. "Izuku Midoriya, you know Bakugou, don't you?" Izuku stiffened. Had Bakugou mentioned him at all? Surely he would have kept quiet about him. He nodded. "Our parents were friends, so we've known each other all our lives." "And the 2 of you get on?" Izuku looked down at his feet. "Well, we used to, but he changed after he developed his quirk and since I didn't seem to have one." Aizawa nodded and looked down at the arena. "Just checking." Izuku took his seat and looked down into the arena. He sat there in silence, waiting for something to happen, before suddenly laughing. He put his hands over his mouth and looked over at M's joke, who smiled and released his quirk. "You just looked like you needed cheering up." "Why so serious, kid?" he shrugged. "I know how hard Ray's been working for this, and everyone else." "Then there's Bakugou. Last time I saw him it ended in an argument. He's probably still mad at me." Aizawa looked over at him. "Midoriya, he's mad at everyone." Marine smiled at him and reached to put her hand on his arm, but it passed right through. "Sorry, my quirk does that sometimes. Well, most of the time, things just pass through me," he explained. Marine just nodded and moved her hand back. Aizawa seemed to narrow his eyes again. "Let's just watch the test." After what seemed like forever, the ground opened up in the center of the arena and Izuku could see the candidates. Class 1A were stood near the front and Izuku could just make out Ray and Taru, stood together at the edge of the group. He waved to them and Ray waved back, smiling widely. She tapped Taru's shoulder and she joined in. Taru said something to Ray and she started laughing, looking over at Aizawa for a second. Her eyes then met her parents and her expression turned icy. Izuku looked closer. "They appear to be wearing targets." "What are they doing?" "You weren't there when they told us." "I guess that makes sense if you're just a friend," Marine asked. Zero smiled and explained what was happening. Izuku nodded and watched as the test began. Together, Ray and Taru ran into the city zone, followed by lots of others. Ray lifted the two up onto a rooftop, looking down at the people below. "I lift them up, you hit them," Ray suggested. Taru shrugged. "Sure, make sure their targets are accessible." Ray nodded and a boy was ripped from the floor, picked up by something invisible. Ray held his arms behind his back and held his feet still before lifting him close enough for Taru to reach him. She tapped each of his targets with one of the balls and Ray dropped him again. "It seems that we have one out already," a tired voice announced. Taru smiled at Ray who prepared to pick another up. "I'll get this one." Before she could grab anyone, they heard laughing from above them. Ray and Taru looked up to see a brown-haired boy floating above them. Ray quickly shielded they from him, ready for any attack he would try, but there was a sudden gust of wind that quickly grew stronger. Ray had to reach out to the edges of the roof to stop the two of them from falling. Balls were pelted at them and Ray winced as they crashed into her tentacles. "You okay?" Taru had to shout to be heard over the hurricane that surrounded them. Ray nodded slowly and snatched a few balls from the air. "I've had worse," she yelled back. The wind died down and Ray dropped the shield and released the edges of the roof, looking up at the guy still floating above them. "Good work," she said, grabbing Taru and walking row the edge of the roof. "With a quirk like that you could be a great hero." The boy nodded and flew out of the arena. Ray looked out over the arena. "We need to find more people. I can see some people in the mountains area. We should head over there." Ray and Taru continued with their previous strategy and both easily passed the test, making their way out of the arena. When Izuku heard the announcement of them passing, he stood up and cheered. Ray and Taru both looked up at him and laughed. Aizawa, however, was less excited. Izuku must have been lying. He remembered what he had heard Bakugou say, those desperate words that had thought must be connected to Izuku. "I killed him, I killed him, I killed him." Not to mention his quirk, which he couldn't help but think he had seen before. He searched the arena and spotted Bakugou. Who did he kill? THX for watching. What if Deku became a ghost? Out.